Okay, we will get started. Good morning and welcome to our conference, Keep Kids in Classrooms, Stop the Use of Exclusionary Timeout Rooms in Schools. My name is Stephanie Krantz. I'm a senior attorney at the Disability Law Center, and I'm so grateful for the turnout today and the real overwhelming interest in this topic. And I'm pleased to provide a short introduction to our day together. We have a very full day, so I'm just going to keep my beginning remarks short. To start, I'll provide one piece of information that strikes me again and again. I've been working for a long time on these issues, and I have found across the board a shared interest in changing how behavior intervention is happening in our schools. Parents, teachers, students, administrators, and state agencies are all interested in making changes. And I hear again and again that people would like information and training on trauma-informed alternatives. These changes will positively impact students, teachers, and schools as a whole. In 2021, the Massachusetts Department of Ed released an advisory on reducing and eliminating the use of timeout rooms in schools. In addition, recently, the Department of Ed released $1.5 million of grant money for schools to get training and had an overwhelming number of applicants from public, collaborative, and private approved schools in the state. There is momentum for continued change in this area and incorporating trauma-informed practices. Our goal today is to provide this concrete information in a user-friendly format. This morning, we will provide an overview of the issues, including a keynote speaker, concrete updates on what's happening on the federal and the state level, a personal story from a parent, and some words from the executive director of the Disability Law Center. We will then have a lunch break from 12 to 1, and at 1 o'clock, we have breakout rooms with exceptional expert trainers on these issues. We will close the day with a panel of representatives from all of the sponsoring organizations. This hour will include many important takeaways, so I would encourage you to tune in to the 4 p.m. panel. The day will also be recorded, and everybody registered will receive a link with all from both the webinar portion as well as the breakout rooms. There are many people to thank who made this day possible. My planning team includes Tim Sindelar, Senior Counsel for EdLaw, and Emily Lamarca, an incredible parent advocate you'll be hearing from this morning. Our co-sponsors are EdLaw, TASH, Parents Professional Advocacy League, Massachusetts Advocates for Children, Federation for Children with Special Needs, and the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress. I also want to thank Amanda Gasparonis at DLC, who put countless hours into setting up this event. Lastly, I want to thank our keynote speaker, Guy Stevens, and all of our panelists and presenters for giving their time and energy today and for their ongoing work in this area. We have a wealth of knowledge in this virtual room. We have over 300 people registered for the event, and I believe today will truly make a difference for children in schools across the state. A few technical tips and reminders. There's one Zoom webinar link for this morning that we're on now, and that same link will be used for our 4 p.m. closing panel. You should have received a second Zoom link for your breakout room. Each breakout room will have 3 speakers and runs from 1 to 4 p.m. Don't worry if you want to hear speakers in another room than you were assigned. You will receive a recording and can watch that later. Lastly, there's so much momentum in this area, and we're excited to build our coalition. We would love to hear your feedback, thoughts, insights, and questions. I believe that a range of voices will help make needed changes and positively impact children in our schools. Don't hesitate to reach out and keep the conversation going. I will now introduce our keynote speaker. Guy Stevens is the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, a nonprofit organization he started in 2019. AASR is a community of over 30,000 parents, self-advocates, teachers, and school administrators, paraprofessionals, attorneys, related service providers, and others working together to influence change in supporting children whose behaviors are often misunderstood. AASR's mission is to inform changes in policy and practice to reduce and eliminate the use of punitive discipline and outdated behavioral management approaches and end the school-to-prison pipeline. The vision of AASR is safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. Guy Stevens is a national expert on the issue of restraint and seclusion. He has presented at conferences and events across North America and has provided guest lectures for undergraduate and graduate courses. Guy is frequently cited in news and media coverage related to restraint, seclusion, and other forms of discipline. Guy is the vice president of the board of directors for the ARC of Maryland. He's on the board of directors for PDA North America. He's an active member of the Alliance to Prevent Restraint, Aversive Interventions, and Seclusion. Guy believes that we can do better for all children and adults. If we can, we must. Guy understands that we must embrace neurodiversity and neuroscience to create safe and inclusive environments to ensure equal rights and opportunities for all. I'd like to warmly welcome Guy Stevens.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. And I am really excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my presentation here as I'm just saying good morning here, and we will go ahead and get started. So give me 1 second here to get everything ready to roll. And if all has gone well, you can hear me and you can see my screen, and we are ready to go. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here today. And I really greatly appreciate all the work that's being done really in Massachusetts and across the world. I mean, there's a lot of positive things that are happening, and there's a tremendous opportunity for positive change. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be part of the event today. So, of course, our focus today is about keeping kids in classrooms. You know, how do we end the use of exclusionary timeout rooms in schools? And this work, of course, has been focused on, what's happening there in Massachusetts, but much of what you're going to be hearing today applies everywhere that we're working with kids. So I think that there's a lot of fantastic opportunity to learn today from a host of amazing speakers. So I thank you again for being part of this. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. Stephanie, you gave me a great introduction, so I don't really feel like I need to say a whole lot more. Other than, as Stephanie mentioned, I am the founder of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I think probably one of the most important roles that I have, and many of you will probably relate to this, but as a father, I'm a father of 2 amazing children, and my children are really the inspiration for my work, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that directly in a moment. But I also am driven by some very fundamental core beliefs. And one of those core beliefs is that we can do better, that we can do better for kids, we can do better for teachers and staff, and that when we can do better, not only should we, but I think we have an obligation to do so. I happen to live in Maryland, so a little south of Massachusetts, but on the same side of the country here. And of course, Maryland is known for the Chesapeake Bay and blue crabs. So if you're in the area, come and see us and enjoy some blue crabs while you're here. Stephanie, you mentioned about kind of the other things that I do in terms of working with the ARC and PDA North America. And of course, do a lot of work around the issue of restraint and seclusion. I'm going to share with you a little bit about, I guess, my journey. And I would say somewhat of an unexpected journey from being a parent to being an advocate to ultimately quitting a job I had been in for well over 20 years to start a nonprofit because I cared about the outcomes of children and teachers and staff and thought that we could do better. My entry into this work began because I have a neurodivergent son. My son was physically restrained, secluded, and traumatized in a Maryland public school. I'll be honest with you, prior to this being done to my son, I would not even have imagined that restraint and seclusion were things that might have happened to a child in school. Certainly wouldn't have imagined a child with a disability being physically restrained and secluded. Unfortunately, we had that experience. It led to a lot of trauma for my son and for my family. And that led me to having some pretty candid conversations with my son. If you looked at what our state law in Maryland said at the time that this was done to my son should never have been physically restrained or secluded. Our state law followed some of the federal guidance that had been out for a number of years around when these things might be done. And according to that guidance and according to our law, it should never have been done to my son, but it was. And it led to some pretty significant impact. What started my journey along the road of forming the Alliance was a promise that I made to my son, kind of reflecting what had been done to him. I said to him, I said, Cooper, what was done to you is not okay. And I made a promise to him that I would do whatever I could to make sure that what was done to him didn't happen to him again or other kids like him. And that led me down a tremendously deep rabbit hole doing a lot of research. I wanted to understand why these things were happening, who they were happening to, and ultimately what we could do differently. I began my advocacy work initially working within our school district to change their policy and ultimately their practice around the use of restraint seclusion to really, I think, amazing outcomes of them significantly reducing restraint and eliminating seclusion. But that's what started my journey. And that from there went into kind of a deeper dive of this. It wasn't just about restraint and seclusion, but it was restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, very broadly, all of the punitive and exclusionary things being done to kids, very often in the name of behavior. So that is what started my journey. And that journey led me to form the Alliance. And in 2019, as Stephanie mentioned, I started the Alliance, really initially with the goal of raising awareness and trying to influence change. At the time I started the Alliance, I don't think I would have imagined that I would be here speaking to you today. I don't think I would have imagined that I would have decided to leave my job that I've been at for many years to, start this nonprofit and dedicate my time and life to this work. But the deeper I got in, the more I realized there was a need, and that need is affecting lives and affecting outcomes. So our mission at the Alliance is really about informing changes in policy and practice and reducing and eliminating the use of punitive exclusionary discipline, outdated behavioral management approaches, and even trying to have an impact on the school to prison pipeline, which unfortunately is alive and well here in the United States and is leading to a lot of negative outcomes. So our focus at the Alliance is really on a lot of this punitive exclusionary discipline. And again, I've kind of said these things before. It's not just restraint and seclusion. It's suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. Yeah, we still have 19 states in the U.S. that allow you to hit a kid in the name of discipline. It's the use of timeout rooms. It's the school to prison pipeline. It's a lot of things that we're often doing to kids in the name of discipline. And why we care about that and why I care about that is that we know today that this punitive and exclusionary discipline, it leads to trauma. It leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. It leads to lower academic performance, lower educational attainment. It leads to kids getting pushed out along the school to prison pipeline. It can even lead to long-term health issues and structural marginalization and mental health impacts. There's a tremendous impact. And again, driven by that idea, if we know better, we can do better. Knowing these things, we have to ask those questions. What can we do? What can we do to improve things? While at the same time recognizing these are really difficult times. These are difficult times for teachers, for staff, for school administrators. However, I happen to have a firm belief that we can improve outcomes for kids and at the same time improve outcomes for teachers, staff, and the adults as well. So our work at the Alliance focuses kind of broadly in three areas. We focus on legislation, education, and a certain amount of support as well. We've been working to change laws and policies, whether at a local level, working with the school district, a state level. About 2 years ago, we worked across the state of Maryland to put a prohibition in the use of seclusion in our schools. We have testified on bills across the country. I've had the opportunity to testify to congressional committees on federal legislation. We are trying to change laws and policies, and that's important work. But what I would say to you is the more important work is changing minds, hearts, and practices. So we do a lot of things in the realm of education. We do every 2 weeks live podcasts. We do conferences and events. I speak to graduate and undergraduate courses, really trying to influence an upstream change. The education piece is so critical because when we know better and we can do better, we can ultimately see far better outcomes. So a lot of our efforts are really around that education piece, and we do a certain amount of individual support as well. So this might look like a parent, a self-advocate, a teacher reaching out to us in a situation where there's a lot of punitive exclusionary discipline happening maybe to their child or in their classroom, and they're looking to find ways to move away from these approaches. And we try to support and work with people that are kind of on that journey and ultimately trying to do better. We are driven by some core beliefs. The very first time somebody asked me the question, and this was in the context of a conversation about restraint and seclusion, and they asked me the question of, what do you want us to do instead? Okay. And I would say to you, the very first time somebody answered that question, I don't know if I had a great answer. But I'd like to believe that the only time I didn't have a great answer was the first time somebody asked me that question. Because I took that question seriously and went back and did a tremendous amount of research, began reaching out to experts from across the world, really trying to answer that question. What can we do better? How do we better support kids and ultimately teachers and staff? And what that's led me to is kind of our foundational beliefs around what we believe is a better approach. And at a high level, it's about an approach that's trauma informed, that's neuroscience aligned, that's relationship driven, that's collaborative, and that's neurodiversity affirming. And again, we know more today about the impact of trauma. We know about generational trauma. We know about the many students that are coming into your classroom that may have traumatic experiences and background. We know there's an intersection between disability and trauma. And of course, there are trauma-informed approaches that are beginning to make their way into many schools around the country that are creating positive change. We believe very strongly in neuroscience-aligned approaches as well. And what I would say about that is, over the last 30 or 40 years, really since the 1990s, we've learned more about the brain and the body and behavior than we've known in all of time before that. We have a new lens on behavior that really is informed by science. And when you begin to look at the behavior that children exhibit through the lens of the brain and the body and the nervous system, you see behavior differently. And seeing behavior differently is an opportunity to respond differently and ultimately have different outcomes. So that neuroscience can really inform our practice and our approach. And of course, when people ask me about what's important in education, I often say the 3 R's, which are relationship, relationship, relationship. We know this. We know the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely they are to succeed, the more likely they are to recover from trauma. Relationships are a tremendous influence over positive change. And of course, we all do our best work for people that we know and we like, people that we're connected with, and relationships are critical. We're huge proponents of collaboration. Whether you're a parent trying to change something in your school district or you're a teacher working with a student, when we collaborate, we open a tremendous door to possibilities. When we move from doing things to people or doing things for people to doing things with people, we really open a world of possibilities, and we open the door to success. So collaboration is so critical. And of course, today, this idea of neurodiversity affirming, understanding that there are different kinds of brains, that we are wired differently, understanding individual differences, and not only understanding, but celebrating those differences, looking through the lens of not there is one right way or correct way of being, to we have differences, and those differences can be strengths. So those are kind of our core beliefs in anything that we might do to make a difference. And of course, I've highlighted this already a number of times. One of my favorite quotes, it's probably in 90% of my presentations. Maya Angelou said famously, "Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better." Today, we know better. We know better when it comes to punitive and exclusionary discipline, and we can do better. And throughout the day, you're going to have an opportunity to hear from people, hear about approaches that really are focused on that doing better. So I'm very excited about our journey here today. So our agenda today, I'm going to talk a bit about what I call the problem, which is, why are there certain kids that seem to be chronically misunderstood in the name of behavior, that are far more likely to be on the other side of a lot of punitive consequences and discipline? What is the problem? Why are some kids being misunderstood, and why are these kids more likely to many punitive outcomes? We're going to talk about timeout specifically as it relates to Massachusetts and as it relates to this work. But again, the work that we're sharing today and the things we're talking about really apply to this broader umbrella of punitive and exclusionary practices. And then we're going to talk about a better way. And to me, this is a journey about hope. This event happening is about hope. The people that have been working to put this together, and I know have been working on this for quite some time, beyond just the event, but about bringing positive change. There is a lot of reason to have hope, and the things that will be shared with you today, I am very optimistic will inspire you and give you some hope about things that we can do to affect positive change. And I do want to say, whether you're in Massachusetts at a school or a parent, whether you're outside of Massachusetts, we have people, I think, that were registered from all across the world for this event. I think you're going to find some things that will be helpful to you in this journey, and I look forward to it. So let's begin and talk about the problem. And I talk about this problem a lot because I think it's really at the key to what's happening and what we're seeing when it comes to a lot of the punitive exclusionary discipline. And the problem at its heart is that many children are being misunderstood in the name of their behavior. And, you know, these children that are misunderstood in the name of their behavior are far more likely to find themselves on the other end of punitive exclusionary discipline, on the other end of restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, timeout rooms. And of course, this can lead to additional trauma and stress, which are leading to really poor outcomes. So a lot of kids, in my view, are being chronically misunderstood in the name of behavior. Why? Why are some kids being misunderstood in the name of behavior? And what I would say to you is that we have a situation where much of what we're doing is not working for certain kids. Much of what we're doing in many situations is not working effectively for kids that need help the most. So a lot of the approaches that are very common in our schools today, and common even in households and in other settings, many of these approaches are heavily influenced by things like operant conditioning, behaviorism, reward and consequence models. Much of this is based on research that, is well over 100 years old. Ideas that were brought into kind of the behavioral discussions around, operant conditioning, reward and punishment. And what we are finding increasingly is that these approaches are often not effective with children with disabilities, neurodivergent children, children with a trauma history. And some of these approaches are not effective with any children, or not necessary with other children as well. But the outcome for the kids that are misunderstood is really dismal. So if we begin to drill down and look at, who are these kids that are more likely to be misunderstood? And again, we can judge that by the outcomes that they're seeing. We can judge that by who is more likely to be restrained or secluded, who is more likely to be suspended, who is more likely to be expelled. And we have data. We have data on a national level. We have data there in Massachusetts. And what that data tells us is that children with disabilities far more likely to find themselves on the other end of restraint or seclusion. Black and brown children more likely to find themselves on the other end of suspension. Kids with a trauma history. So we know that kids with disabilities, Black and brown children, kids with a trauma history, far more likely to be misunderstood in the name of behavior. And we can even drill down and we can look according to disability. Autistic children, far more likely to find themselves misunderstood in the name of behavior. We can drill down into non-speaking autistic children, far more likely to find themselves on the other end of a lot of behavioral interventions. So we know there are certain kids that are chronically being misunderstood. And what we know is that there are certain reasons why kids are far more likely to be misunderstood. And I want to drill into some of those ideas today of why I believe that there are certain kids that are far more likely to be misunderstood, far more likely to find themselves on the other end of a lot of punitive and exclusionary processes. And those include childhood trauma. And of course, we have more kids coming into our classroom than ever that have experienced trauma. In the wake of the pandemic, we suffered a worldwide pandemic that was really traumatic for, I think, especially our children. If you were 10 years old when the pandemic hit, suddenly 20% of your life was a world that was unsafe, a world that you weren't even allowed to go around people that you normally went around. This trauma had an impact. And I think we knew, I think many of us were having conversations about this, that when kids went back to school, things were going to be challenging because here, this world had experienced this traumatic event, and we were going to see an increase in stress and anxiety and trauma that would lead to behaviors. So childhood trauma, really critical. We're going to talk a little bit about current behavior management approaches and why some of those are not working for kids that need help the most. And we're also going to highlight a couple of things around understanding. What can we shift in our understanding? How can we look at things differently? How do we look at disability differently? Or, why is it important to really understand the idea of neurodiversity affirming? So we're going to look at these three factors and how they may contribute to why children are misunderstood. Now, about 20 years ago, there was a pretty famous study done by Kaiser called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study, it's often called. And the ACEs study looked at kind of adverse experiences that happened to children when they were young. And then it looked at the impact. It was a long-term study, looked at the impact that it would have. So children that had more of these adverse experiences, what was the impact later on in life? And what they found is that, there was a certain percentage of people that had at least one thing that they would consider an adverse childhood experiences. And these varied. They were kind of defined in the study, but it might be experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect. It might be witnessing violence. It might be having a family member that was incarcerated or attempted suicide. There were kind of a list of things that they looked at in this study. And what we found is that about 64% of adults had at least one type of adverse childhood experience, but there were some, about 48%, that had 1 to 3 of these adverse childhood experiences. And then the study found that the increased number of these adverse childhood experiences could lead to different outcomes further along as the child was moving into adulthood. And these were kind of impacts that really were significant. So, for example, we found that people that had an increase in adverse childhood experiences were more likely to find themselves addicted to alcohol or drugs, more likely to have long-term health impacts. We're talking about cancer, diabetes, heart disease. So early childhood experiences could lead to trauma, and that trauma could lead to long-term health impacts. And of course, another very important factor in all of this is that these adverse childhood experiences led to impacts on relationships. People that have experienced trauma, people that have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, this can affect their ability to connect and relate and have healthy, stable relationships. And that's critical in education, because in education, to access the thinking, rational, logical part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, we have to be regulated. We have to be connected. And that connection is so important to educational outcomes. But again, the impact of trauma affected the ability. We've probably all heard this before, that sometimes the students that need the relationship the most are the ones that have the most difficult time asking for it, or might be the most resistant to it. But these are kids that often need our help the most. And many times there's roots in trauma to much of what you might be seeing. And we know today through neuroscience, through really deep investigations into trauma, that trauma actually changes the brain. And I don't mean that in a figurative way. There are actual changes that occur in the brain due to the impact that happens during trauma. Changes to our prefrontal cortex, the thinking, logical, rational part of our brain. Changes in our amygdala, which is part of our limbic system, which is kind of our threat detection system. In children, it can become more active due to trauma and due to prolonged stress. And when that happens, you might begin to see more big unexplained behavior occurring in a classroom. So often the things that you might be seeing downstream are the result of trauma that occurred upstream. And by adopting trauma-informed practices and neuroscience-informed approaches, we can really better understand and better respond. So understanding the impact of trauma is really, really critical here. And even understanding the impact of our approaches around behavior. Many of the approaches that we have around behavior, as I mentioned previously, are not working for kids that I believe often need our help the most. And part of this comes down to the fact that our focus is on the behavior. I would say that that's the wrong focus. We need to focus upstream. We need to understand kind of the origins of the behavior. We need to understand what is really beneath the behavior. And, very often we look at behavior through a very specific lens, and we think about it all being a matter of intent. It is not. Our behavior is far more complex than that. And, people often say things like behavior is communication. I agree to that to an extent. Behavior can be communicating a need or a difficulty. But even more fundamentally, our behavior is biology. It is how we are wired. Our bodies are wired for survival. And much of the behavior you see, in fact, is not intentional misbehavior, but rather it's a stress response. It's our body responding to keep us safe. And again, much of what we're doing today around behavior is not working. And that not working is leading to really poor outcomes to certain children. So again, we need to look at this differently. We need to understand that behavior is the symptom. Behavior is not the underlying cause. By focusing on the behavior, we're often missing what's underneath. And, I'll also say that a lot of our approaches to behavior today are not working because, again, they're assuming that it's intentional. They're assuming that people are making choices when, in fact, there's often far more to human behavior than that. We really need to go upstream if we're going to change what we're doing. And that's one of the beautiful things about today is that you're going to be hearing from amazing experts in this field who are focused on that work to go upstream and understand what we can do differently to better support kids who are often not giving you a hard time, but are often having a hard time. Talk a little bit about behaviorism because it's a very common approach in our schools. Behaviorism is a theory that states that kind of all behaviors are learned by interactions with our environment, a process called conditioning. And through a lens of behaviorism, behavior is kind of a response to stimuli. Kind of something happens and then we have a behavior, or we change it in some way by offering a consequence of some kind, and that our behavior is shaped in that way. And in fact, there are people that are kind of strict behaviorists that believe you can train a person to do anything with the right kind of conditioning or motivation. Behavior is more complex than that. There's more beneath the surface. Not to mention, from a standpoint of behavior, I don't look at it as training people. Humans are far more complex than that, and that should not be our goal. Is to train people to be compliant. It should really be about how do we raise and help support healthy human development. So one of the core problems in my mind with a lot of these approaches that focus on kind of the behavior and behaviorism is that it treats all behavior as if it were a matter of intentional. And then if you believe that all behavior is intentional, you try to manipulate or change that behavior through a series of rewards and consequences because you're assuming it's a matter of choice. However, very often that's not the case. And as a result, these things that we do sometimes are not working. And they're not working because human behavior is far more complex than just sticker charts and rewards. I would also say that part of this issue is that we're sometimes focused on the wrong thing. I don't love the word compliance because many things are done to humans in the name of compliance that are sometimes harmful. And I'll dive into that more deeply. Before I dive in, I just want to mention this cartoon. Some of you may have seen it before. It's by a very talented neurodivergent artist in Australia. The cartoon here shows an adult holding a clipboard with a pen, writing, and behind the adult, we see a pool, and we see hands coming out of the pool that look like a child drowning. And the adult's writing on the clipboard, student would not comply with instructions to swim. Now, that's making a point, but it's a really powerful point. Sometimes we're so focused on the compliance aspect of this that we miss the fact that we have a kid that doesn't have the ability. We have a kid that's under a lot of stress. We have a kid that has a trauma background. We have a kid that's neurodivergent. There are underlying factors of why a kid can't do something and why they can't do it in any given moment. We all have capacity that fluctuates depending on what we're under or what might be influencing us in that moment. And of course, I do want to point out here that, in terms of compliance, yes, we need children that understand that there are rules and that they need to work with others and they need to be able to follow directions. But compliance shouldn't be our goal. And very often compliance is our goal. And when compliance is our goal, we sometimes are pushing kids to the point of escalation that leads to crisis situations, that leads to situations where then kids find themselves on the other side of a lot of punitive things. So ultimately, our goal should not be compliance. Our goal should be about raising children that are curious, that are eager to learn, that grow into be happy adults. And compliance-based approaches, in fact, can actually lead to creating very vulnerable children who are vulnerable to abuse. So this is a really important part of the kind of that behavioral equation. The other thing I want to talk about is knowledge. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge out there today. There are webinars and training and books and tremendous amount of knowledge out there. We live in an information-rich age, and there's a lot of knowledge out there about trauma-informed approaches, about neuroscience, about things that we can do differently. However, a lot of this knowledge is still lagging. It's lagging in higher education programs. It's lagging in our schools. So we need to be more proactive. We need to bring more of this knowledge that we have into our schools, into our systems, if we want to create change. And I believe that we can do that by doing things like what we're doing today, sharing information, piloting different approaches. I think there's a tremendous opportunity. But let me talk about what some of those things are. Some of those things, shifts that I think that we can make that, again, come with some knowledge. The way we look at disability. Very often disability is viewed through what they call the medical model lens. And the medical model is kind of a lens that looks at disability as kind of a dysfunction, disorder, kind of a difference, and looks at it against kind of a typical standardized measure. And it's kind of a deficit model. When we look at disability through a deficit model, we look at what's wrong with a person, and then kind of what we need to do to this person to help them to meet a certain measure. And unfortunately, that leads to low expectations. It leads to situations where people lose independence, choice, and control of their lives. The medical model is a very prevalent model, but there's a better way, in my mind, to look at disability. And this is all, again, about knowledge. The social model of disability is a construct that really came to the life through the disability movement. And this model looks at disability not in terms of what is wrong or what the deficit is with a person, but looks at what does an individual need to be successful? What are the barriers in the classroom, in society, in the world that might be preventing that person from being able to achieve the things that they want to achieve? So rather than looking at the person as having a deficit, we look at society, we look at the world, and we think about how do we remove barriers? And that's a very simple change, but that knowledge of kind of looking at the world through a lens of a social model versus a kind of a deficit model can change our perspective. It can change our response. Information about the intersection of trauma and disability. We talked about trauma earlier, and I'm really pleased to see a lot of trauma-informed approaches beginning to get a foothold in schools and other settings. But there's often something that's missing. People often don't realize the intersection between trauma and disability. And what I would share with you is that many individuals with disabilities experience trauma related to their disability. Again, when you think about that world through the medical model, through you have a deficit, you are not, you are not the neurotypical person. When you look at it, it affects how people view themselves. Think about at times how traumatizing the world might be. I mean, the simple difference of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world can be traumatizing. If you were a non-speaking autistic individual trying to communicate your needs and wants and not being heard, not being listened to, imagine the trauma that can come from that. So, again, when it comes to knowledge, our knowledge about trauma, it's growing, it's fantastic, but understanding the impact and the intersection with disability is another important knowledge piece that I think we need to move towards. Understanding our own impact of our expectations, our thoughts, and our beliefs, critical, because our thoughts and our beliefs affect our actions. What we think and what we believe affects the things that we do. And interestingly enough, when we're working with others, the things that we do affect how other people see themselves. And if it affects how they see themselves, it also affects their actions. So it's really critical for us to understand and have this knowledge of the impact that our beliefs and our actions have on others. So a lot of critical knowledge that we can change. Neurodiversity affirming approaches. I'm a huge believer in the need for neurodiversity affirming approaches. Understanding that that there's a wide and natural variation on brains, and not trying to pathologize behavior because it falls outside of a neurotypical standard. Understanding that brains can be wired differently, understanding that this is part of the human condition. So I think, again, neurodiversity affirming approaches, critical knowledge that we can bring to help us change what we're doing. So again, these are some of the things that I believe lead to kids being misunderstood. It's around our, approaches around behavior. It's around trauma. It's around knowledge. What's the impact of being misunderstood? There's a tremendous impact. Kids that are misunderstood are far more likely to be restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, placed into timeout rooms. All of these things are often more likely to happen to kids that are misunderstood. And this has a tremendous impact down road as well. If we look at kids that are often on the other side of a lot of punitive and exclusionary discipline, these kids more often restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment. It affects how they see themselves, how they think about themselves. Kids that don't feel safe and welcomed in school are more likely to become disengaged. We're more likely to see school avoidance. We're more likely to see kids that drop out. And that disengagement leads to a situation where kids are more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. And of course, kids can from there end up in the criminal justice system. And there's data out there that is really unnerving. If we look at our data from state and federal prisons, 60% of prisoners in state and federal prisons identify with having some sort of disability, ADHD, autism, depressive disorder, anxiety, a number of different things, cognitive disorders. So again, the outcome of being misunderstood are outcomes like ending up incarcerated. And these are things we can change. We can change these outcomes. And this, to a large part, is why I continue to do the work that I do. When I started my work, it was about what happened to my son. My son today is doing fantastic. He started college earlier this year. He's doing really well. But a lot of kids aren't having good outcomes. A lot of kids are ending up kind of down this school to prison pipeline, and it's avoidable. We can do better. The other thing I want to talk about here is the trauma that we are often causing due to the punitive and exclusionary discipline. What we already know is that kids that are more likely to find themselves on the other end of punitive and exclusionary discipline are kids that have a trauma history. And one of the things that we know about trauma today, as I mentioned earlier, is that trauma changes the brain. Those changes that occur in the brain can lead an individual to be hypervigilant, can lead an individual to kind of not necessarily feel safe, to be more likely to feel on alert. And a child who is hypervigilant is a child that is far more likely to have what we would term kind of distress behavior. I'm not saying misbehavior, bad behavior. I'm saying distress behavior. It's a child that is likely to have behavior because they don't feel safe. Maybe they don't feel welcome. Maybe they are overwhelmed by anxiety. And often those distress behaviors, which might be big behaviors, are met with compliance demands. So a kid is having a hard time. A kid is exhibiting this big behavior, and the initial approach is very often focused on compliance. Now, I understand why that happens, but what I will say is that very often those compliance demands not only fail to de-escalate a kid who's having a hard time, they actually lead to further escalation. And that further escalation, if a child isn't already there, can lead to a fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is an autonomic response. This is the body responding to keep the child safe, but it might lead to really big behavior, like a child running out of a room, a child pushing everything off their desk, a child kicking or spitting. And that big behavior very often leads then to additional punishment, leads to additional exclusionary discipline. And that punishment, guess what, leads to trauma. So what we're doing every time we go through this cycle is we're further traumatizing a kid, we're further sensitizing their nervous system, and we're actually leading to a greater likelihood of increased behavior, not decreased behavior. And we need to get off of that wheel if we really want to change things. We also need to understand that punitive discipline itself can be quite dysregulating. And one of the things that we know today, because of the neuroscience, is that in order to learn, we need access to our thinking, logical, rational brain, our prefrontal cortex. That prefrontal cortex goes offline when we become dysregulated. If we're upset, overwhelmed, stressed, that thinking, rational brain can go offline. And if we look at what we're hoping to accomplish when a child is having a hard time, we often talk about like, oh, well, we need punitive discipline to teach them a lesson. Nobody learns when they're dysregulated. Punitive discipline leads to dysregulation. And, yet the cortex has to be available if discipline is going to work. If you truly want a child to learn, you must teach, not punish. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about the word discipline and really how we should look at it as opposed to how sometimes we do look at it. So the take-home message here is that there are many children that are chronically misunderstood in the name of behavior. Children with disabilities, neurodivergent children, Black and brown children, children with a trauma history. And this happens in part because of many of the approaches that we have that aren't working. Many of the approaches that are focused on, kind of the idea that all behavior is intentional, that are focused on rewards and consequences. Many of these things are not working. And these children are suffering some really poor outcomes. The good news here, though, is that there are better things that we can do and we can better support children. So I want to talk a little bit about timeout rooms. Timeout rooms, and again, this is kind of focused here on this Massachusetts issue. But again, timeout rooms are used in schools across the country, and there are concerns about them being used in schools around the country. Now, from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, they talk about timeout as a behavior support strategy in which a student temporarily is separated from the learning activity or the classroom, either by choice or by direction of the staff for the purpose of calming. Now, we know, of course, that there's something called timeout. There's something called seclusion. I'm not going to go deeply into seclusion today. Seclusion is putting a child in a room or area against their will and not letting them out. Often also done for the purpose of calming, although I will tell you, there is nothing calming or therapeutic about being put in a room against your will and not being let out. It is quite traumatic and tends to, again, lead to an increase, not a decrease in behavior. But this idea of a timeout is that it's supposed to be something a little more temporary. However, the lines often become somewhat blurred, and concerns have been raised in Massachusetts and across the country about the use of timeout rooms. In fact, parents and advocates have been raising concerns for a number of years. You're going to hear from one of them here shortly about the use and the impact of timeout rooms. And I can tell you that the impact of these interventions sometimes is significant, leads to significant trauma. And again, that increase in trauma is leading to an increase, not a decrease in behavior. So in Massachusetts, while seclusion is prohibited, what we found is that the use of timeout rooms in Massachusetts often had kind of a pretty blurry line between a timeout and a seclusion. And the impact was often very similar, meaning that kids that were put in timeout rooms were often quite impacted by the use of these interventions. And again, nothing uniquely calming or therapeutic about being put into a room against your will. Now, in 2019, there were some investigations into this, and across the state, NBC had requested records. They found that there were about 100 districts that said they didn't use timeout rooms. 64 said they did. A number of them didn't answer at all or said they don't have documents that respond. But of course, the question here is that, okay, there are some districts that are using them, some that are not. What are those that are not using them doing instead? People often believe that the interventions that they use are necessary. And what I would say is that, things like seclusion, absolutely not necessary. There are better things that we can do, and of course are being done. And we're going to talk heavily about what some of those things are later today. Now, here's the good news. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, they have been listening. They have been listening to parents, listening to advocates, listening to many of the people that helped to organize this event. And in 2021, they put out guidance really aimed around reducing and eliminating the use of timeout rooms. They recognize the impact of these issues. And they also recognize the fact that they could really lead to harm. So they offered some guidance out there around, the idea of reducing the use of these rooms and eliminating them as an intervention. And it was a pretty strong recommendation. And in part, they talked about the idea that, these things should really only be used in very limited circumstances. And that, they acknowledge, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education acknowledge the trauma and academic loss that inappropriate use of timeout rooms could cause. So really fantastic news that the work that was being done in the state was being heard. The department was concerned and doing things to really bring about change. And of course, that led to something that Stephanie mentioned earlier, which are these grants. So now there are these grants out there that are available for schools in the state who are looking to do something else, to move away from the use of these timeout rooms. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity, for schools, and a fantastic opportunity to bring in positive change. And although in the context of this grant, the focus may be timeout rooms, the truth of the matter is that the things that you're going to hear about later today, the things that you're going to learn through these presentations, the same things that you're going to learn about that it would help to reduce and eliminate timeout rooms also will help and reduce other punitive exclusionary forms of discipline. So these same things can help to reduce and eliminate restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, and ultimately improve the outcomes, not just for the kids, but for teachers and staff as well. So to me, this is a really positive change and a fantastic opportunity. And again, whether you're a parent watching this or you're a school, if you're a school, might look at how you bring this training into your school. If you're a parent, you might be thinking, oh, gee, how do I advocate to bring these approaches or this training into our school district? Even if you happen not to be anywhere near Massachusetts, it's a fantastic opportunity. So, of course, there's a better way, and there's a better way, and there's hope. I happen to be a huge proponent of this quote from Reverend Desmond Tutu, which is there comes a time where you need to just stop pulling people out of the river and go upstream and figure out why they're falling in. We need to go upstream of timeout rooms and restraint and seclusion and suspension and expulsion and figure out why are kids having a difficult time? Why are they not meeting the expectation? How do we better understand and support children to improve the outcomes? So going upstream is really important. And in doing that, we ultimately need to change our perspective, our philosophy, and our practices. And a change in perspective can go a long way in changing how we see children and how we respond to behavior. Even understanding this is a child who is having a hard time, not a child that is giving me a hard time, really helps you to look at a child differently. Understanding the behavior iceberg. My friend and colleague Mona Delahooke has this great analogy talking about all the things that are underneath the behavior, individual differences, stressors, trauma. Understanding behavior through a neuroscience lens helps us to respond differently. Understanding that many of the big behaviors that we see in classrooms, and they're big and difficult. I'm not trying to minimize that. Many of these behaviors are, in fact, what we would term as a bottom-up stress response. What we know today about neuroscience and the neuroscience behavior helps us to look at these behaviors differently because we have learned that not all behavior is intentional, that there are kind of yes, there are kind of top-down thoughtful behaviors, but a lot of our behavior, especially with children, especially with very young children, children that have a trauma background, children with neurodivergence, a lot of the behavior that we see is kind of what we would call bottom up. It's driven by our nervous system and our body's imperative to keep us safe. And when you begin to look at behavior through a neuroscience lens, you see behavior differently. And again, that influences what you do. Dr. Stuart Shanker, friend, colleague, says, see a child differently, see a different child. Neuroscience can help us to do that. So there's a tremendous opportunity with this information today. Looking at the word discipline differently. The word discipline actually comes from a Latin word, which means to teach. If we want to teach, we have to have a brain that's ready to learn. A brain that's ready to learn is not a dysregulated brain. It's a brain that is connected to others. It's a brain that is regulated. And very often, though, we think about discipline as doing things to kids or punitive consequences. The truth is we need to focus more upstream. How do we teach? How do we help people learn skills and ability? How do we do things to better equip individuals that are often, on the other side of having a hard time? A very simple shift in philosophy. As I mentioned, Dr. Shanker's, see a child differently, see a different child. Dr. Ross Green says, kids do well if they can. Simple thing to say, but if you put it in context, very often in our minds, we look at the idea that kids do well if they want to. If you think kids do well if they want to, you look at it through a motivation lens and you think about rewards and consequences. When you see this idea of kids do well if they can, you quickly can kind of shift into this idea of what's the need? What's the challenge? What's the difficulty? How can I better support this child? So even shifting our philosophy makes a difference. And you can put that in practice. If a kid can't read, what do? We order a reading intervention. We help them to develop the skill and ability to read, and we work to support them. What we don't do is hand them a book and say, read the book and you'll get a cookie. Read the book and you'll get a sticker, because that would be ridiculous. The child needs help developing the skill, the ability, learning something along the way. But we very often approach behavior that way, where we think it's a matter of motivation and we say, okay, we'll meet our expectations and here's what you will get, or here's what will be done to you if you don't. And we aren't successful with those approaches because we need to take different approaches that understand that dysregulated behavior is often not a matter of choice, but is related to a dysregulated nervous system, and we can do better. So, kind of as I wrap up, I just want to mention that throughout the day, what an amazing opportunity. I mean, again, I've got to give a tremendous amount of credit to all the people that organized this event. You, in this single event, have the opportunity to hear from experts across the world, experts that have been doing work really to get upstream and to help better support kids and create better outcomes for teachers and staff as well. So you've got a tremendous, and I'm very actually proud to call many of these people friends and colleagues, people that I've had the opportunity to work with who are doing absolutely amazing work. If you were a school or district, you would do no wrong by working with any of the folks that you're going to hear from today. Tremendous opportunity. So again, this is all about the many great options that you have today as we listen, and ultimately that is going to improve our outcomes. You know, the impact of shifting away from punitive exclusionary discipline is ultimately going to help us create safer schools, more supportive environments. Again, not just for kids, but for teachers and staff. And that's important because these are difficult times. And when we can improve the outcomes for our teachers and staff as well, we're gonna improve our entire system. So I think that there's a tremendous reason to embark on this journey. And again, it's about knowing better and doing better. So with that, kind of our take-home message here is that, you know, with the neuroscience and trauma-informed approaches, we can do better. We can shift our philosophy. Shifting our philosophy, we can change our actions, and our actions can lead to far better outcomes for everyone. So with that, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But before I do, my contact information is here. I welcome anyone to reach out to me. I'll be presenting later this afternoon as well. But you're always welcome to reach out. I want to thank the organizers again for the opportunity to speak today. And I'm excited to actually be here and listen to all of the great presentations today. My slides will be made available, and there's a link here as well if you'd like to capture those. So with that, let me go ahead and stop, and I will hand it back to the organizers here.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was an incredibly powerful and informative presentation, and I so appreciate your time and sharing today. And now I would like to welcome Emily Lamarca. Emily has been a pivotal part of our team working on these issues since 2020. We're so grateful for her skills and dedication to this work. Emily began her advocacy journey in 2006, and this has included working with the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress, being involved in the First Call program, sharing her testimony in front of the Massachusetts Joint Committee on Education to Improve School Safety, acting as a parent advocate for the Commonwealth's Restraint and Seclusion Prevention Initiative, sitting on MDSC's Government Affairs Committee, and volunteering with the Alliance Against Restraint and Seclusion. Emily has such important connections with decision makers in the state, as well as national and international leaders in the field. Emily has moved many by telling her personal story, and we are truly grateful that she has agreed to present today. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning. I just want to thank everyone again for being here today. For me, it's just it's such a hopeful day. And I'm really encouraged to see so many people coming together to find the best way to support our classrooms. I've been asked to share today from a parent perspective, and this is a perspective that I imagine that many of you can relate to, no matter what capacity that you're here in today. But we're all working towards the same goal, and that is for our children and the adults that support them to be physically and emotionally safe in our schools. I thought a lot about what I wanted to say today, and I did speak with my son Cole about sharing his experiences with exclusionary timeout rooms. Of course, it was important for me to first get his permission. His experiences are very personal and still sensitive for our family, particularly for Cole. But he did say it was okay, and in his words, it was because he wants to help people. It was also important for me to make clear up front that when I share Cole's experiences, that I'm not placing any blame or assigning any fault. I wholeheartedly believe that if exclusionary timeout rooms are in use, the intention is not malicious. However, the outcome is. The outcome, as our family and others can attest to, is life-changing and causes severe, everlasting trauma. Trauma is defined as a deeply disturbing experience that occurs when an event happens that significantly overwhelms the nervous system. This overwhelming event for Cole was the repeated use of exclusionary timeout and restraint. Frankly, it broke our son, and we had a front row seat to see it happen. We saw the charismatic little boy we knew change, and we felt helpless. It was heartbreaking and it was jarring for our whole family, but especially for Cole. I often tell people that when our son Cole was born, that he flipped our world upside down in the best possible way. He was perfect and he was born with Down syndrome. From the beginning, Cole has had this innate love of life and the ability to appreciate every moment as special. And he has taught our family so many lessons in such a short time. Cole is known in our house for giving great advice or comforting sentiments when he sees one of us is struggling. And of course, he is always good for a joke or a good zinger here and there. He loves music, and his playlist does not discriminate. It has everything from Johnny Cash to Billy Joel to Eminem, The Grateful Dead, Green Day, and of course, some Disney soundtracks. He is kind, he is loving, he is sincere, funny, thoughtful, and smart, just as he was the day he started being restrained and forced into timeout rooms in his Massachusetts elementary school. He was 10 years old. Everything about the timeout room traumatized Cole. The time he spent there, the way in which he was brought there, and he was traumatized by seeing his classmates brought to the timeout room, asking about the sounds they made when they were being carried to what he called the naughty room. I don't think that we consider this piece enough when we talk about these rooms. I think we assume a child willingly walks with an adult to the room to calm down. However, it is very different. I spoke with a teacher about an experience that she says has never left her. She was visiting a new school and a child became upset and dropped to the floor screaming. The child was picked up and taken to a timeout room where the adults stayed outside the room and gave the child a certain amount of time to calm down. When this didn't happen, the child was picked up and put into a padded area within the room. She was told later that day that the student was purposely set off so that she could witness how bad it could get. She said that although parents were aware of the restraints in timeout rooms, she wondered if they truly understood what it looked and sounded like, particularly for the child's classmates that would see it all happening. Exclusionary timeouts are often preceded by the child being immobilized by a restraint. Then they are carried against their will with their brain and body telling them to fight for their lives, and so they do. They scream and they struggle, and then they are shut in a room where they're expected to calm on their own before they can leave. And the next day, they are expected to come back as if nothing had happened the day before. The only explanation I have for this is that we often think of children as being resilient. They bounce back. But children are human. And if this happened to any one of us here today, I would argue that we would be traumatized and we would not be able to go back to the place of trauma the very next day. But these children simply don't have a choice. Their trauma is underestimated. And this is where that vicious cycle that Guy spoke of, the cycle of seclusion and trauma begins. Renowned trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk has done extensive research in the area of immobilization and trauma. Van der Kolk explains that when bad things happen, you're supposed to activate your fight or flight response to get out. When you cannot, your brain gets rewired and sets up new neural pathways to no longer take action and to no longer move. This is what we call shutdown, and often what is misinterpreted as calm. So when we see a child calm down, it's not that they've decided to do it, but instead their brain and body has just simply shut down. And van der Kolk says that when this happens to any organism, the instinct of purpose is destroyed because they are trapped. Immobilization is very central to the concept of trauma. Cole's first incident involving restraint and exclusionary timeout was because he wouldn't come in from recess when the bell rang. He was carried into the school and eventually into what I can only describe as a storage type closet off another classroom. There was nothing in the room except a filing cabinet. Cole would spend close to an hour in this space on more than one occasion with the door shut, while staff engaged in planned ignoring. When we learned of this practice through a conversation with his teacher, I asked to see the space. She needed a key to access it, and I remember quite vividly walking in there and instantly feeling anxious and sick to my stomach. If I, as an adult, felt this way, knowing full well that I could walk out at any moment, how would a child feel when they couldn't? It didn't take long for us to find out. During a 9-day period, Cole was restrained or forced into a timeout room 13 times, despite our request to not be put in the timeout room. We started to lose the Cole that we knew. He regressed to wetting the bed at night, having nightmares, telling us about angry eyes at school, and begging us to not make him go. He was nervous around people where before he would walk in a room and seek out connection with any person that he could find. And when I would pull into school to drop him off, he would climb into the back of the car and try to hide. When we asked Cole about school in the days that he was restrained and secluded, he would tell us that it hurt and his teachers fought. I assumed he meant that the staff were arguing amongst each other, but years later, he made it quite clear to me that what he meant was that the teachers were fighting his classmates. We learned that Cole was restrained for periods of up to 10 minutes at a time, and in one instance, restrained while wearing a weighted vest, although he had a documented cardiac condition. The last incident before we removed Cole from school was over an hour and a half long, where he was restrained and physically moved to different timeout rooms. He was locked in the timeout room for an hour, where he disrobed and lost control of his bladder. A response I would come to learn is a very common trauma response, particularly one you see when a child is locked in a timeout room. This innate response is fueled by intense fear and almost always misunderstood as intentional on the part of the child. Cole's neuropsychologist at the time recommended that we immediately remove Cole from that school. The ill-advised behavior management strategies being used had caused Cole severe anxiety at this point. So we removed Cole and we started to look for out-of-district placements. Most schools would not take Cole because on paper, Cole was aggressive and violent. This right there, this breaks my heart because Cole is just the opposite of this. But now, at that time, he had become a child with a history of physical restraint and the need for isolation because of his behaviors. Behaviors that prior to him being restrained and secluded, we had never witnessed at home. The schools that were open to meeting Cole all utilized timeout rooms. There was one school that we toured that had a timeout room in the basement, and the inside walls were a padded blue color. And I remember the door was this big, heavy door, and it had an eye opening. And the eye opening had bars across it. And all I could think of was that it was something from a scene of a horror movie. And this is where children were being brought when they were at their most vulnerable. So without any placements that we felt Cole would be safe in, we uprooted our whole family and we moved to a new town. I remember at that time thinking that it would all be okay. You know, Cole would go to a new school and just leave everything behind. I just had no idea how trauma worked. But over the next 6.5 years, through conversations with other parents, experts in the field, teachers, mostly through our experiences with Cole, I would learn that trauma is everlasting and that trauma becomes a part of you. Trauma changes your brain and it changes how it develops. It changes the way your reality is experienced. Trauma trains your brain to expect danger and manifests itself within the body. Trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. And there's no timestamp on trauma, meaning the brain can't decipher something happening in the present because it is operating in the past where the trauma occurred. In the months leading up to Cole's new placement, he shared what he could about his experiences and always on his time and terms. He told his 7-year-old sister over breakfast one morning that his teachers would lock him in the room and that he tried to get out, but he couldn't. And another time he had said to me, "Mom, I might like a new school, I might, but one where they don't hurt me." He was fearful when we went out into the community and often asked what would happen if he saw his old teachers. Still to this day, I have to reassure Cole that his teachers cannot come to our home and hurt him. In his therapy sessions, Cole's psychologist would note Cole locking himself in the therapy dog's crate because he was a bad boy. He would then lock the stuffed animals in there too because they were also bad. He was formally diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder from harsh treatment, the misuse of restraint and seclusion in the school setting. Nightmares of his old school continued, and when Cole started a new school, I began to understand just how everlasting trauma is. He was constantly anxious and hyper-aroused and was unable to attend school for more than 2 hours at a time. His teachers would note that he was consistently worried and had distrust of every adult that was in the school. If you remember, trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. So Cole would constantly be triggered without warning. It would take months before I could pull into the school's driveway without Cole hitting his head against the back of the seat and begging me to turn. And I remember I would back into my driveway after I dropped him off at school so that when the school called to tell me Cole was triggered, that I wouldn't lose those precious few seconds in getting there. Cole would come home and self-talk for hours. He would tell us that his brain was telling him that he was at his old school and he had to fight. And when the book fair came to his new school, Cole was afraid because he thought his old teachers would come to his new school and hurt him because they had once had a book fair at his old school. For anyone that goes through trauma, but specifically for Cole, his processing has taken time. 2 years passed before he told us that an aide would take his food away from him. Suddenly, it made all the sense in the world as to why the first thing he did when he arrived at his new school was to intensely eat all the food that was packed in his lunchbox. But Cole did make progress at his new school. It was slow, but it was absolutely progress. It took patience and compassion on the part of his team. However, almost 2 years into the placement, Cole refused to go to an enrichment where he had not established a relationship with a teacher yet. He communicated his fear that his old teachers would be in the room. An administrator, fully aware of Cole's traumatic past, stepped in because he felt it was necessary to take a hard line with Cole, that Cole would learn to manipulate situations and get out of the tasks that were being asked of him. That hard line triggered Cole and sent him back into fight or flight mode. He was locked in the classroom without any of his classmates for 3 hours. During that time, it was documented that this administrator sat and just stared at Cole, not speaking to him for almost 15 minutes. When Cole got up from where he was told that he couldn't leave until he cleaned up the room. And once he did this, he would still have to go to the enrichment. My husband and I received written accounts of what happened that day and of a few others that followed. And it made sense as to why Cole once again regressed to wetting the bed at night, having nightmares, and communicating his fear of school. During one of those timeouts, the administrator had grabbed Cole's arm to pull him where he wanted him to go. Cole acted out the scenario over and over at home and even did so in his therapy session. Our trust was once again broken, and we felt the only choice that we had left to help Cole heal was to homeschool him. We have been homeschooling Cole since 2019. He has thrived in the home environment, and it's not because I'm an outstanding teacher, but it is because he has a sense of unwavering safety here. There's no hierarchy of power. We work together. He's always met with patience and compassion. And the days that he doesn't have it, I understand. There are days that I don't have it either. And so I don't force it. And he has never learned to manipulate me into not doing the work. Cole is always seen and heard and has uncovered a passion for cooking. He has even helped create and publish an illustrated cookbook, which he is so proud of. I finally feel like we have the Cole back that we knew. And for some time, I wasn't sure if that would happen. But the trauma is still mixed in with his life. There are times he has nightmares of his old school, and he still talks about what happened. And although not as much, he is still triggered. Not long ago, Cole had to have his blood drawn. He was nervous, and the two phlebotomists were trying to move quickly. He stopped them and said to them, "I know you don't know this. When you do this, it reminds me of my old school when my teachers would hurt me." I was so proud of him for advocating in that moment. And at the same time, heartbroken that life's experiences will continue to trigger these memories for Cole. I think Cole will always try to make sense out of a situation that doesn't make sense. It will always be with him. It's a part of him now. This journey is not one that any parent would sign up for. You have a front row seat to your child being harmed, and the whole family goes into survival mode. When families speak up, many times their child's trauma is minimized or dismissed. One parent I spoke with told me that the principal couldn't believe that her son was still scared because it had been a month since he had been put in the timeout room. When families have other children in the school district, sometimes they don't speak up because they fear retribution. And often there's no recourse with exclusionary timeout because the regulations around timeout rooms are just gray enough to create loopholes where seclusion can occur. Just over 3,800 children were restrained last year in our Massachusetts schools. And although we do not have recorded timeout room data, I think it's a safe assumption that many children are also subjected to exclusionary timeout and thus subjected to trauma. I have spoken with many Massachusetts families, and I have the utmost respect for them for sharing their child's story with me. It's not easy to relive an incredibly difficult time, a time that for many is still ongoing. I want to thank them for their bravery, many of which are working in some way or form to ensure this doesn't happen to other children. One mom ran for a school committee to create change. Another advocates for families in her town free of charge, just so they will not have to go through what her family had to. Others are sharing their stories and getting involved in different ways, because although they cannot change what's happened to their child, they can change the path for others. The experiences that I will share next are summarized significantly, as the fallout from exclusionary timeout rooms often spans years. One of the parents that I spoke with shared her daughter's story. Her daughter began being restrained and secluded in kindergarten. When she was 11, after a difficult bus ride to school, she was immediately brought to the timeout room. She would remain there until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. While in the timeout room, her daughter had disrobed and lost control of her bladder, and she was not allowed to leave the room until she was able to complete compliance drills, or what Cole School had called shaping exercises, meaning the child must spell words or point to colors, anything that shows that they're being compliant. And this means that when they're asked to do this, that they're asked to access that part of the brain that isn't even available because they're in fight or flight mode. Like many of the other parents I'd spoken with, this mom knew in her gut that what was happening was unsafe and disturbing, but she complied with what the school was doing because she didn't know what else to do. She trusted them. Not long after this incident, her daughter became suicidal. She told me the message that her daughter was receiving was that she was broken, but it should have been, they broke you. Another parent spoke of how her son also started being restrained and secluded in kindergarten, and how they've seen their son grow from being very curious, happy, and socially motivated into a child with severe anxiety, isolation, and feels timid all the time. Now a teenager, he continues to struggle to go to school. When he was 9, he needed his parents to escort him from room to room at home. And when he used the bathroom, he needed one parent to stand outside the door the whole time. At night, he would build a wall of stuffed animals in his bed to shield himself from the door. And he was unable to make it through a single night without needing one of his parents to sleep beside him. And when someone came to the home, he would hide in his room or under furniture until they left. At the advice of his neuropsychologist, his family found a private approved special education school. His first year, 70 out of the 110 students enrolled were restrained 840 times with 57 injuries. Timeout rooms were always accompanied with restraint, and the school would leave her son in the timeout room long after he calmed, because they would routinely go through their own process of compliance before letting the child out of the room. His mom shares that today, his anxiety is still palpable, and he functions at a much lower level than his peers because of it. His most recent neuropsychology report noted prolonged use of solitary rooms has caused anxiety to escalate to the point of being unable to sleep, as he continues to struggle with significant insomnia, an issue that has further exacerbated his anxiety. He has inconsistent school attendance and trouble focusing in class because he needs to be hyper aware of everyone that's around him so that nothing unexpected can happen. His whole family continues to be impacted by his trauma. He is unable to participate in activities outside the home, including family vacations or visiting relatives over the holidays. Another parent shared with me how their child also started being restrained and put in timeout rooms at the age of 5. She shared that he would be dragged to a timeout room, which was a closet with no door. Staff would then stand in the doorway and block him when he tried to escape. He was brought to the timeout room whenever he did something wrong, impulsive, had trouble following directions, anything that was a symptom of his disability. He would physically fight when teachers tried to bring him to the timeout room, resulting in hours of a power struggle that was no longer about the lagging skill that got him into trouble in the first place. In a 4-month period, this boy had been restrained 94 times and had spent over 24 hours in the timeout room. Because of his behavior, there were only 2 schools that would accept him, one of which had a central cell area that kids were brought to, and the second had 2 timeout rooms. But she noted that many times the lobby was also utilized as a timeout room. Staff would block the doors so that children couldn't leave. Over the next 3 years, her son was restrained upwards of 70 times and spent approximately 50 hours in timeout rooms that she knows of. She noted that most restraints occurred when her son would try to escape the timeout room, and that he was constantly fighting to get out. Eventually, her son found a placement in which he has been at now for over 2 years. This school uses a framework that you'll hear more about today. He has had zero restraints and they have no timeout rooms. Another parent shared that her son, who had experienced significantly early childhood abuse, neglect, and trauma, and who was adopted from foster care, started being restrained and secluded in kindergarten. The restraint and seclusion continued for 7 years in 5 special education settings for children with documented emotional disabilities. The school experiences were so re-traumatizing that he began refusing to attend school and was afraid to leave his house. To allow him to heal, the family chose to follow the recommendations of his mental health clinical team to begin homeschooling. Some of his experiences took place in what his mom described as a prison camp. When he exhibited behavior directly linked to his trauma and disability, he would be placed in a closed glass office-like structure in the hallway. He would then be directed to sit or stand on a red dot while the staff watched him. He would have to stay there for a certain amount of time before he could be let out. If he moved, time would start over. Eventually, he would be brought to another room with a urine-soaked carpet and dead insects. He would be shut in with the door closed. In this room, there was no time expectation for getting out. At home, he began urinating on the carpet when he was stressed, just as he and others had done in the timeout room. This child is now 25 years old. He told his parents that he wasn't allowed to be with other students for most of his time at school because he is considered not fully human and not worthy of being with other humans or receiving a life or worthy of receiving a life-saving vaccine. This brave young man has written something for me to share today. When he was done, he confided in his mom that it made him really sad to write about his experiences and that it took him a while to do so because he needed to store up emotional energy. He also told her, and I'll quote, "I had needed to do it outdoors in a park where I knew I had space and could walk around as I wanted to, and that I could breathe fresh air so I didn't get overcome with flashbacks of those bad memories. I would recommend that anyone who makes a statement about isolation rooms be in a place where they can feel freedom of movement, and also that they write it rather than talk with someone about it, so they can think and process and find their own words at their own pace." He also said that he was glad to have the chance to share his statement, and he hoped people would take in what he had to say because he really wants to help other students and end the practice. This is what he wrote. "Isolation is not vacation. I spent more hours in confinement between the ages of 7 and 8 than I did in class. The reasons ranged from being restricted from going to lunch with my classmates to being shoved into a little room where I would only be let out if I sat on a red square quietly for 5 minutes. At age 10, I attended another school and was the unwilling guest in even more solitary confinement rooms, which were carpeted and smelled of urine as a result of the faculty's refusal to allow students to use proper waste management facilities. If that weren't bad enough, there was also no clear goal set for release. A teacher would more or less let you out when they felt like it and not before." These are just a few examples of the thousands of children and families that are harmed by exclusionary timeout rooms. And I hate to leave you with such vivid images, but I also think it's so important to personalize the children that are being harmed. I spoke today from a parent perspective, but from a child's perspective, I can only imagine being excluded from your peers because of something that is beyond your control sends you a message that you are bad and that you need to be separated from the good kids. It sends a message that you're not worthy of comfort, compassion, or understanding, and that you're not worthy of having your basic human needs met or your bodily autonomy respected. I worry that exclusionary timeout rooms have become normalized. They're even being designed into newly built schools. I think timeout rooms are often justified as being the only way that we can contain the unsafe behavior that we see. But the presenters here today will show us otherwise. And we have seen schools in Massachusetts remove timeout rooms, and they have been successful in maintaining safety for everyone. And we need to remember this is happening to children. And although resilient, how can we expect them to be resilient against something that you and I could not be? They need us to do better for them. And I think that's why we're all here today. I strongly believe that Massachusetts can be an example for other states. Our Department of Education has made a commitment to helping schools find ways to reduce and eliminate exclusionary timeout rooms. We have strong organizations that advocate for children. Those organizations are sponsoring this event today. This afternoon, there were over 300 people coming together to hear from 12 exceptional speakers who have collaborated for decades with schools and families. And the frameworks that they will share with us today are effective, therapeutic, and I will argue they are life-changing. Representatives from the Department of Justice and the Massachusetts Attorney General's office are joining this conference, and they are willing to share their vast knowledge with us. And there are researchers here who have spent countless hours on the issue of exclusionary timeout rooms. I just think that all of us here today can be the change that we want to see, the change that we desperately need. So please share all the things that you learned today with as many people as you can. Help us create the safe and therapeutic schools that our children and teachers deserve. Thank you again for being here today, and thank you for taking the time to hear from me.
Thank you so much, Emily. I so appreciate your willingness to share your personal story as well as stories of other children who have been harmed by these practices. I find it incredibly powerful and important to add to this discussion today. So thank you again. We're going to take a short break now for about 6 or 7 minutes, and we will join back at 10:35 to hear from Barbara, the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center, and then we will have our panel where we're going to report on federal and state updates. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Welcome back from the break, and now Tim will introduce Barbara.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before I do that, I just have to say that I really want to thank Emily for the incredibly powerful statement that she's just made. We wouldn't be here today without Emily's bravery and her hard work. And it is the statement of parents like Emily that make this work so important for us. And we're glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. At this point, we'd like to introduce Barbara Battalion, the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center. Barbara has been a leading advocate of the intersection between politics, law, healthcare, and policy for 25 years. She served as a state representative and a state senator in the Massachusetts legislature. During that time, she focused on the rights and needs of people with disabilities, seniors, people who are economically disadvantaged, and the LGBTQ community. Her advocacy concerning autism built the service delivery system in Massachusetts for educational, social, emotional, and medical support, and included establishing and chairing the first Autism Commission, as well as passing comprehensive mandated medical insurance coverage that has been important for thousands of families in Massachusetts. Barbara gave up her state Senate seat to run for Congress in 2018 as a mom on a mission to fight for Medicare for all. She's also been a government affairs director for the Massachusetts State Treasurer and for the ARC of Massachusetts. And as I started at the beginning, is now currently the executive director of the Disability Law Center. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tim. Really appreciate the opportunity to address this group today. And I, really want to thank Guy Stevens for his presentation and Emily for her incredibly powerful story. it's really critically important that we move away from traumatizing practices and give concrete options to teachers and staff members. So I'm going to take you back to 1995. My then 5-year-old son, Rudy, who identifies as a person with Asperger's, was subject to timeout and suspension as a kindergartner. There was an expectation that he could sit still, that he could turn take, and that he could sit down and draw pictures. And this for a kid with physical dysregulation, an inability to stop when he had trying to communicate a thought in his head, and had significant fine motor challenges. So he was disrupting his classroom. There is no doubt about it. And the net result was that he was placed in the principal's office for days and days on end. And his self-worth really hit rock bottom. As was mentioned by Emily, this impacts not just the young person involved, but their parents, the entire family unit. We really had to have this kid hit absolute rock bottom. His self-esteem was gone before the school system would do anything proactively to address this issue. I remember him being suspended from school for a kid bumping into him misunderstanding the intent of the behavior, and he hit the person with his soft-sided lunchbox, and it resulted in a 1-week suspension. So we had to get lawyers involved. The teacher just so happened was very supportive, knew she needed more training, more assistance, ended up with an aide. And although it wasn't perfect that first year of kindergarten, we did a little bit better. But with each year, first grade, second grade, as the situation changes, the teacher, the aide changes, given the uneven level of training and support and preparation, we continue to have really rocky experiences, culminating in my son being shown the door from the public school system midway through grade 2. And then he actually landed in a school that Tim Sindelar and I were both part of creating, that ended up providing a much more therapeutic situation for my son. So not unlike Guy, who decided to become a professional in this field, and not unlike Emily, whose incredible advocacy has gotten us to this point, I decided as a parent that what I could do was run for office. So I ran for state representative, served there, also served in our state Senate, and really started working with both the Disability Law Center and Mass Advocates for Children on a whole host of special education initiatives, including recognizing IEPs needed to reflect the whole day, unstructured times, social interactions, in addition to academic achievement, and getting an autism waiver started, a federal waiver for supports, and AAC training embedded into the teacher prep curriculum for special educators. So let's fast forward. At the Disability Law Center, we were receiving many individual complaints, which we began investigating and monitoring. Stephanie does this work, and we have other fine DLC employees that assist her. We had so many individual school system complaints that it felt like whack-a-mole, that we quickly realized that we needed to look at this issue, not as an individual school system issue, but as a systemic issue. Stephanie then began working with Emily, with Tim and others, utilizing parental surveys, going around the state, beginning sort of that critical information gathering, and educating and informing parents and school systems that you're hearing about today. I applaud DESE for recognizing that this is an issue of deep concern to our students, to their families, to the teachers, the staff, and the classmates of those students. It's very traumatizing to observe what happens when you do not have the proper training to see an issue that's beginning to build and try to use positive behavioral supports to avoid a total meltdown. Ideally, whenever possible, it's really great to work with decision makers and work within the system. And that is the real success story here, is that born out of Emily's experience and other professionals' experiences, and tapping and knowing who the network of experts are to be able to assist. I think Desi also understood this was a problem, and being able to have a seat at the table for high-level input into how to make these changes is, in my opinion, as a former legislator, optimal. Whenever you can work within the system, you want to be able to work within the system. And so I think that's fantastic, speaking as someone who had to oftentimes do legislation to kind of force the hand of statewide organizations. So it's wonderful that there's $1.5 million in grants available this year to provide expert assistance to school systems. But the reality is the demand far exceeds the capacity. There are far more school systems that understood that this was an invaluable opportunity to train their systems. And we do know that DESE is going to renew the grant for next year. But I would posit that it would be important to really commit to ensuring that every school system has this training. I will share that recently a local school teacher who I'm very close to mentioned to me that in their school system, someone in her school was sort of tapped on the shoulder and said, "We have to have a behavior plan, come up with a behavior plan." And that person is like, "I don't have the tools, I don't have the training, I don't know where to begin." And that's my fear, is that sometimes school systems will, get a directive and maybe not implement it in a way that's fully informed with all of the information that we have at our disposal these days. So I really hope that there will be a commitment to ensure that every school system has this training. I completely agree with Guy that this training ought to be embedded in both undergraduate and graduate teacher training. It ought to also be part of making sure that teachers are renewing their CEUs. I think that this is critical training that I think teachers are hungry for. And I will share with you an example that I mentioned a few minutes ago, where when I was in the legislature, we worked to legislatively ensure that the AAC, alternative and augmentative communication devices, that training happen for all special ed teachers during the training process, and be required for subsequent training for other teachers, because we were finding that they were not, many folks were having someone land in their classroom and didn't necessarily know how to use the machines. So there are ways in which you can make change happen, right? So in that instance, that could have been done at the Board of Education DESE level. It was not, and so we did that legislatively. So there are many paths to be able to accomplish what's needed. I truly hope that we will be able to, again, try to ensure that this training, these opportunities are set up for all school systems to ensure that there is success for everyone. And sorry, just one more thing I wanted to say. This afternoon, there will be a panel at 4 of all the key folks that worked on this and our key coalition partners. I'm really looking forward to also new regulations that will be happening sometime later this year, put out by DESE. And I'm really hoping that we're going to get to a point where well-trained teachers and staff will allow us to completely eliminate timeout rooms. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I feel very honored to be a part of this, and there's so much we'll be learning already have learned earlier and will learn throughout the course of this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. We really appreciate those statements. So we next have a panel of a number of legal experts and one of the chief academic researchers in this area. And we think that this should provide you with a lot of very important professional information to help you understand the issues here and help you advocate on these issues as we move forward. So joining us now are Liza Hirsch from the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, Jim Eichner from the U.S. Department of Justice, Matthew Gillespie from the U.S. Department of Justice, Bridget Benacasa from the U.S. Department of Justice, and Michael Kresnik from the University of Massachusetts. Let me give you a little bit of information about each of our panelists. I'll start with Liza. Liza Hirsch is the director of the Children's Justice Unit at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, where she works to advance justice and equity for Massachusetts children and youth through civil investigations, litigation, policy, and community engagement. Prior to joining the AGO, Liza was a senior attorney at Massachusetts Advocates for Children, where she provided representation to low-income families in special education and school discipline matters and directed the program on disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. Previously, she had worked as a manager in the Holyoke Public Schools, where she worked with district leaders, parents, and community organizations to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion in the Holyoke Public Schools. She began her legal career as a Skadden Fellow and staff attorney at the Mass Law Reform Institute and at the Medical Legal Partnership in Boston, where she represented homeless and low-income families in housing and shelter matters. She's a graduate of Northeastern University School of Law. Jim Eichner is a trial attorney in the Educational Opportunities section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Since joining the Educational Opportunities section in October of 2014, Jim has worked to enforce federal civil rights statutes which prohibit discrimination in schools on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, language status, and disability. He has done multiple investigations focusing on the improper use of seclusion and restraint in schools, and has negotiated settlements that have ended the use of seclusion in school districts in Kentucky, Indiana, and Alaska. Jim has also coordinated the Educational Opportunities section enforcement efforts in this area, including reviewing complaints for possible investigation. In addition, he's worked on numerous enforcement and policy matters related to school discipline and the use of school resource officers and other law enforcement. From 2012 to 2014, Jim served as the managing director of programs at Advancement Project, the racial justice nonprofit legal organization. Prior to joining the Advancement Project, Jim was a staff attorney in the policy group of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, and served as executive director of a commission on equity and excellence in K-12 education chartered by the Secretary of Education. Jim also spent 5 years investigating and litigating police misconduct and conditions of confinement cases in the special litigation section of the Civil Rights Division. Bridget Benacasa is a trial attorney in the Educational Opportunity section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. In this role, Bridget has worked to enforce federal civil rights statutes that prohibit discrimination in schools based on race, color, national origin, sex, language status, and disability. Since joining the section in November 2019, Bridget has conducted 2 investigations as part of the division's efforts to combat improper seclusion and restraints in schools across this country, leading to settlements that have limited the use of seclusion and restraint in school districts in Iowa and Florida. Before joining the division, Bridget had worked for a legal aid organization representing domestic violence survivors and low-income clients in civil protective orders and family law cases. The third member of the U.S. Department of Justice team is Matthew Gillespie. Matthew, as well as a trial attorney in the Educational Opportunity section, and continues the work that both Jim and Bridget have been doing. He has particularly been important as part of the division's efforts to combat improper seclusion of students. Before joining the division, he was an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Iowa's Affirmative Civil Enforcement Unit, where he investigated and litigated fraud and civil rights violations, and served as an assistant attorney general in the Iowa Attorney General's Office where he represented the state's Medicaid agency. And our academician for this panel is Dr. Michael Kresmian. Dr. Kresmian is professor of special education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also the co-founder and the founder and co-director of the Center for Youth Engagement, a research and evaluation center dedicated to supporting marginalized and minoritized learners. Michael has leveraged funding from foundations, state departments, and federal departments to advance work focused on supporting youth who are part of the school-to-prison pipeline, including those involved with the juvenile and adult prison systems. Michael's been actively involved in research, evaluation, and investigation on topics of disproportionate discipline, disproportionate use of seclusion and restraint, and disproportionate incarceration of individuals with disabilities. Through his work, Michael has established numerous partnerships with community organizations as well as state and federal agencies, and these partnerships have yielded sustainable mechanisms for advancing outcomes for our most vulnerable learners. He has close relationships with behavioral health organizations, local police departments, and adult and juvenile correction system. He's currently the research partner for innovative initiatives to create collaborations between the police and behavioral providers to provide diversion from arrest and associated interventions for individuals with serious mental illness and substance abuse disorders. As well, he is leading a project supported by Apple to develop immersive iPad learning environments to support outcomes for incarcerated learners. So I want to thank our distinguished panel, and at this point, turn this over to Liza Hirsch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's wonderful to be here. As Tim said, my name is Liza Hirsch. I'm the director of the Children's Justice Unit at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. And today I'm going to be presenting on the current legal framework in Massachusetts regarding seclusion and the use of timeout in schools. So in Massachusetts, seclusion and timeout are governed by regulations. And seclusion is defined currently under those regulations as the involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room or area from which a student is physically prevented from leaving. Seclusion does not include timeout, which we're going to define in a moment, but seclusion is prohibited in all public education programs, which includes charter schools, collaborative schools, and approved special education schools. By contrast, timeout is defined as a behavioral support strategy in which a student temporarily separates from the learning activity or the classroom, either by choice or by direction from staff, for the purpose of calming. During the timeout, a student must be continuously observed by a staff member, and staff shall be with the student or immediately available to the student at all times. The space used for timeout must be clean, safe, sanitary, and appropriate for the purpose of calming. And timeout must end as soon as the student has calmed. There's required training under Massachusetts regulations regarding the use of both restraint and timeout usage. So all school staff must receive training in restraint prevention, behavior support policy, and requirements around the use of restraint. The training must address the use of timeout specifically as a behavioral support strategy distinct from seclusion. And that training for all staff must occur within the first month of each school year, or for staff that enter after the start of the school year, that training must be provided to those staff members within the first month of their employment. There are also required policies regarding seclusion and timeout usage in Massachusetts under Massachusetts regulations. Schools must develop written policies regarding the prevention and the use of both restraint and timeout. And the policy must explicitly include a statement prohibiting seclusion. The written policy must also include a statement outlining the process for obtaining principal approval if timeout is needed for more than 30 minutes based on an individual student's continued agitation. And that's the precise language of the regulations. Policy and procedures must be reviewed annually, and they must be provided to school staff and to parents. I wanted to also note that there are some additional requirements for approved special education programs. And specifically, in addition to a couple of other requirements, one of the requirements under these additional regulations, 603 CMR 18, are that approved special education programs are required to document timeout room usage, including the length of time, the reason for the intervention, and who approved the usage of the timeout room. And these regulations specify that timeout rooms cannot be locked. So the federal framework regarding seclusion and timeout usage is a little bit different. Although seclusion is not prohibited federally, it cannot be used in a manner that denies students with disabilities a free and appropriate public education or equal educational opportunity under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act or Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, for example, if seclusion is used repeatedly with an individual student without using behavioral interventions, without, for example, convening the IEP team, conducting a functional behavioral assessment, implementing a behavioral intervention plan, or other appropriate behavioral interventions as is federally required, then there may be a denial of FAPE, free appropriate public education or equal educational opportunity under either Section 504 or Title II. Another example is if a student is repeatedly secluded and missing significant instructional time as a result, that's also one factor to consider in the federal analysis around whether there's been a denial of FAPE or denial of equal educational opportunity. So the federal definition of seclusion is similar to the Massachusetts definition, but provides some additional detail and specificity. So seclusion, as defined by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, is defined as, similar to Massachusetts, the involuntary confinement of a student in a room or area from which the student is not permitted to leave. However, the definition goes on to say that it is considered seclusion whether or not there's adult supervision, and if a student believes or is told by a school staff member that they're not able to leave a room or area. So that is considered seclusion under the OCR federal definition. And OCR distinguishes this definition of seclusion from a behavior management technique in which a student is allowed to leave the area or is in a separate location within the classroom, so long as the student has the same opportunity to receive and engage in instruction. So this is the federal definition of seclusion. Again, a reminder that under federal law, seclusion is not per se prohibited, but if it's used in a manner that denies equal educational opportunity or denies a free appropriate public education, then that is considered a violation of federal law. In Massachusetts, seclusion is prohibited. The definition is slightly different from this federal definition. And there is currently under Massachusetts regulations, there is a definition of allowable use of timeout. So here are just some resources. I've included the link to the Massachusetts regulations governing restraint and seclusion and timeout. I've included the link to the DESE's, our State Department of Education's problem resolution system, which is our complaint system, a few OCR, Office of Civil Rights, guidance documents and related materials, and then finally our Attorney General Office Civil Rights complaint form. And I wanted to just finally note before I turn it on to the next panelist that if you do believe that a student is being unlawfully secluded, it is appropriate to file a PRS complaint with DESE, with the State Department of Ed. And if you believe that there's a systemic unlawful use of seclusion or restraint against students with disabilities or students of color or other protected class, it would be appropriate to file a civil rights complaint with the Attorney General's office. In addition, there is also the federal complaint reporting system under OCR and DOJ. I think DOJ will speak to their system. So with that, I will turn it over to the next panelist, who I believe is Michael Kresmian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liza. So yeah, I'm going to walk through a bit about sort of the relationship between timeout and seclusion and kind of the harms associated with that. And I want to kind of reiterate one of the pieces I've heard throughout the talks around the importance of training. And I just reiterate that most school personnel engaged in some of the behaviors that result in kids being inappropriately secluded haven't been trained and don't understand what they're expected to do. And I would just kind of reiterate the importance of training as a central component to any approach to remedy the use of seclusion. And I just want to kind of talk, and I'm showing pictures here of different rooms used as seclusion and timeout rooms, and talk about when is timeout seclusion. And really, whenever the timeout is involuntary and whenever the timeout prevents a child from leaving, either by a held or locked door or by another form of physical prevention. So anytime a student is in a room where in a timeout where they are not allowed to leave or do not believe they are not allowed to leave, it's seclusion. Additionally, one of the important things, it's important to understand that there are often in timeout spaces conditions for release that are not related to safety. So for example, and I'll show a video in a little bit, I've seen examples where students must sit on a blue X on the floor for 30 seconds, or students must sit in a blue square for 30 seconds or some pre-specified period of time. And that also is sort of counter to what the purpose of these are, particularly when the use of these is specifically, to respond to students who are at risk of harm to self or others. And I want to just talk a little bit about timeout. So timeout, fundamentally is a behavior management technique. So it's a way to utilize an opportunity to either ask or to allow a student to independently go to a separate space. And the intention of this is you're removing or withholding reinforcement for whatever the behavior of concern is. So that's really what a timeout is. But it's routinely used as a seclusionary punitive response to address common low-intensity behaviors such as noncompliance, talking out of turn, sending kids there for these behaviors. And then one of the big challenges is when it becomes, the use of timeout becomes used to prevent students from leaving, so it becomes seclusion. You find a conflation among staff members, and this is where the training is really important, that when we say timeout and it really means seclusion, staff believe that the use of seclusion is an acceptable behavior management tool, inconsistent with the purpose of the use of timeout. And again, one of the things I think is critical, and I'm thinking of two of the parents that we've heard talking about the harms caused to their children, is seclusion in and of itself is harmful. It can contribute to long and short-term emotional dysregulation. It's widely considered to be an adverse child event. So these are the ACEs, which are associated with trauma. Being in seclusion can trigger other stressful or traumatic experiences, or it can be traumatizing itself. Students who are excluded may experience serious psychological, emotional, and physical trauma as being part of being in seclusion or being placed in seclusion. And it can also lead to behavioral regression. So there are kind of extensive examples of students who urinate, defecate, vomit while in seclusion, as well as other self-harming behaviors that can occur while in seclusion. So for instance, head banging. And I just give one example here from the USGAO, where a 13-year-old boy with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder hung himself in a seclusion room weeks after threatening to commit suicide, using a cord that a teacher reportedly provided him to hold up his pants. And this is not to say this is what happens. Of course, this is a rare event, but I think the notion that this is what can happen should cause everyone to be very concerned about placing a child into a space where they are alone and can engage in a behavior that harms themselves, including something as severe as this. Additionally, repeated seclusion is associated with increased problem behaviors displayed by individuals experiencing ongoing trauma. So the repetition of seclusion leads to increased intensity of existing behaviors and can often lead to new problem behaviors. So the process of kids being placed into seclusion becomes part of their pattern behavior. So what you start to see is the exhibiting of increased problem challenging behaviors that require, again, the increased use of seclusion, and it becomes a reciprocal process. Furthermore, when students are placed into timeout or seclusion, it removes the capacity of an adult to prevent the student from engaging in self-harm behaviors. Then, as you saw, an example of death, but there are examples of serious behavior. Some typical behaviors that I've seen are kids who are in seclusion rooms and they bang their heads against the wall, and there's a kind of sort of a belief or a thought that the walls are padded, so this could be safe. But what we know about this is that headbanging can lead to numerous negative outcomes, including brain damage, and that it's not the damage against the skin. So the padded cell may prevent the child from getting a bruise on their head, but the traumatic brain damage is caused by the impact of the head and the brain onto the skull. And so what you get are these subconcussive head traumas that can occur while a student is in seclusion. And of course, if that occurred, there would be no immediate way for someone to stop that because the child is in there alone. And I want to kind of just sort of move into the notion that seclusion is never warranted. And I'll talk about this a little more, but what I want to kind of point out is, in order for a student to get into a seclusion, there must be somebody must be physically taking them there. If there is no need to physically take the kid into a seclusion space, then the use of seclusion would be inappropriate. So if we stick to the notion that we can only, you could only utilize a restraint of seclusion when a student is at risk of harm to self or others, by a student being able to walk independently into a seclusion space would demonstrate that risk of harm to others is not there, and that you could only end up leading the student to be in a space where they could engage in injury to themselves, so harm to self. So it's really important to just consider that it's never warranted, that you couldn't, I've never been able to conceptualize of a situation in which it would be warranted to place a kid in a locked cell because there must be a physical restraint leading to that placement. And I'm going to give a little example here, if, and I apologize if people haven't seen these. It is a little troubling to watch. So here you're seeing how a typical seclusion occurs. And so you're seeing kid is brought into a seclusion space, and then what you watch is staff sort of having to try to get out of the door, right? Like this is what the experience is like. So what you see here is the restraint is the way that we get a child into this, but that restraint is ended in ways that are not consistent with appropriate crisis prevention restraint procedures. In other words, there would never be a crisis system which says you should sort of push the kid away until that they can't get to you as you kind of escape out the door. This is a time delayed, so this actually went on for some time. And what you're seeing here is the child has actually been injured. Nobody knew about this. And so the child was in this room for an extended period of time, and you're going to see now adults come in and try to sort of figure out what's going on with this kid. But again, it articulates two really important problems. One, that you're seeing how this is an unwarranted situation. If this child was at risk of harm to others, the seclusion should have been maintained until, or the restraint should have been maintained until that risk of harm was eliminated. And it's inappropriate to put a kid in a place where they can't get access to treatment, which is what you saw here. And then just sort of alternatives to seclusion. I know this will probably come up, but in cases I've been involved in with the Department of Justice and in practice, really, what ought to be happening is when children are engaged in behaviors that are problematic, they should conduct a functional behavioral intervention, functional behavioral assessment, develop and implement function-based behavior intervention plans. You should collect behavioral data, implement empirically validated function-based interventions. So these would be antecedent-based interventions or replacement behavior interventions. And on the more prevention side is using evidence-based proactive responses. So preventing conditions that lead to a crisis, teaching appropriate pro-social behaviors, rewarding and reinforcing when the student is displaying the appropriate behaviors. And this is something often missed, honestly. I think there's a lot of times that what you see is waiting for the problem behavior to occur and then reacting to that, as opposed to identifying and reinforcing all the times when the appropriate behavior is displayed. And then implementing a predetermined crisis plans to keep the students and others safe when there is an escalation of that. And, important sort of three pieces are using trained crisis response teams with a focus on de-escalation. And again, I think you'll see here trained is coming a lot. Using a crisis response team that isn't well trained, that doesn't know how to implement de-escalation practices with fidelity, can lead to increased problems and can cause the behaviors to escalate. I'm training all staff on the principles of behavior and de-escalation techniques so that everybody understands how to respond to students. And when students have a disability and have behaviors associated with that, everybody who works with that student really needs to understand what's that behavior, what is the function of that behavior, and how should they be intervening to implement the student's BIP. And finally, it's important to monitor disciplinary data. So I think one of the things that may happen is we'll say, well, we aren't doing this, and so behaviors are sort of let to get out of control. And I think what I often try to articulate is don't trade problems. The goal here is not to leave a behavior go, but rather to provide intensive, intentional, evidence-based interventions to prevent these behaviors from occurring and reducing the likelihood of any behavior that would lead to the need for restraint. And I think I'm now going to Jim.
Thanks, Michael. And again, my name is Jim Eichner. I'm an attorney with the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, and I'm going to, along with my colleagues, talk to you briefly about the Department of Justice efforts to combat the improper seclusion in schools. And as I think others have touched upon, when we use the term seclusion, we mean the involuntary confinement of a student alone in any room or area. So it covers things that, based on our understanding of Massachusetts law, are considered a timeout and therefore not a prohibited seclusion. But when we think of a timeout, we think of something that is voluntary. And if it's not voluntary and the student is confined alone, it's a seclusion under our agreements and under the way we understand this. So when you hear people talk about the harm of seclusion, we include things that may be under Massachusetts law considered a timeout. So as part of our vigorous enforcement of Title II of the ADA, which Liza mentioned, the educational opportunity section where the three of us work, which is also known as EOS, combats the improper seclusion of students with disability. And we investigate allegations that school districts have a regular practice of secluding students with disabilities and of using seclusion without justification and as a substitute for the kind of appropriate behavior and classroom management techniques that Michael was just talking about. Now, typically we do these investigations after getting heartbreaking complaints from parents who are fantastic advocates for their children, One of the first cases that I was involved in involved a little girl, I think she was 5 or 6 at the time, in Indiana, who stopped going to school because she didn't want to be put in the dungeon anymore. And even after she stopped going to school, she wouldn't go to church because her church was near the school and it reminded her of being put in the dungeon. So, you know, I also want to add the chorus of thanks to Emily for being willing to share her story today and introduce us to my new hero, Cole. It's really important that we hear from parents about their experience and the experience of their children, because that's really makes a difference in our investigation. So EOS has reached a series of settlement agreements in which school districts have agreed to remedy the improper use of seclusion by discontinuing the use of seclusion for all students district-wide and instead putting in place appropriate interventions and supports. Since 2020, we have reached settlements in this area with public school districts in Indiana, Florida, Maryland, Iowa, Alaska, and Washington State. The districts range in size from districts serving over 40,000 students to one serving less than 2,000 students. A number of the investigations that led to these settlements focused on improper restraints and seclusion in specialized programs in schools for students with behavioral disabilities. Our settlement with the Frederick County, Maryland School District and the findings we issued as part of that investigation is regarded as having prompted the Maryland legislature in 2022 to ban seclusion in all Maryland public schools. We currently have a number of open investigations of the use of seclusion and hope to announce more settlements soon. Bridget and Matthew will now talk in more detail about one of our settlements to give you a little more flavor of our investigations and settlements. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone who has joined and participated in this important event today. My colleague Matthew and I are going to discuss one of EOS's investigations that began in October 2020 and is now in the compliance monitoring stage. This investigation focused on a district that serves approximately 15,000 students and has 34 schools, including one virtual school and an off-site program for students with significant social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. In addition to its off-site program, the district uses other programs to serve students with disability-related behaviors. For example, several schools have behavior-focused classrooms and staff where students with disabilities and related behavioral challenges are taught for all or part of the school day. A few years ago, we learned through local media reports and advocates that the district allegedly used seclusion to address general noncompliance in classrooms, like students being disruptive, making noises, making faces at peers, dancing, arguing, leaving the classroom area, and showing verbal aggression towards staff. We learned about incidents of students in seclusion sobbing, calling out for their parents, and using extreme actions to try to get out, like kicking and hitting the door, walls, and window, tearing paper off the walls, removing their clothes, and threatening suicide. We also learned that an 8-year-old third grader at an elementary school in the district was secluded in a windowless electrical closet, allegedly because she would not stop crying in class. Photos of the room showed it had brick walls and metal utility boxes, features that did not comply with state law regulations regarding seclusion rooms. We also received a copy of a complaint filed with the State Department of Education about this district's seclusion and restraint practices. Once we opened our investigation, we requested and reviewed many documents and data from the district related to its seclusion and restraint practices, including district and school level policies and procedures, codes of conduct, and discipline policies, prior seclusion and restraint complaints against the district, seclusion, restraint, and crisis management training materials, more than 2,000 student incident reports describing seclusions, restraints, and transports, and student individualized education plans, functional behavior assessments, and behavioral intervention plans for students with disabilities who had been secluded or restrained. During the course of our investigation, we also interviewed district central office personnel responsible for overseeing the district's administration of special education services, met with the district superintendent, visited several schools, and interviewed dozens of school administrators, teachers, and support staff. While on site in the district, we observed designated seclusion rooms in most of the schools we visited. The rooms varied in size and appearance, but shared several key characteristics. As you can see from the photos on this slide, most rooms were small, typically no larger than 6 feet by 6 feet, with bare padded walls, a large metal door, and a locking mechanism that staff engaged by holding down a button outside of the room. We also observed that many of the seclusion rooms significantly limited sound going in or out, which contributed to an overall sense of sensory deprivation. Similarly, almost all seclusion rooms had only one small window about 5 feet up from the ground. Because of this, a student within the room had no means other than the window, which some students may not even have been tall enough to see out of, to know what was happening outside of the seclusion room. Some seclusion rooms in the district were surrounded by a larger transition area, and others were located within behavioral focus classrooms, which again are classrooms that specifically serve students with disabilities. You can see an example on this slide of a seclusion room located within a behavior focus classroom. During interviews, one school administrator admitted that these seclusion rooms were located in behavioral focus classrooms as a matter of convenience, highlighting a discriminatory practice confirmed by the district's own data, which showed a connection between the use of seclusion and students with disabilities. We also found that, in addition to designated seclusion rooms, the district secluded students in classrooms, offices, and other spaces, sometimes referred to as calm down rooms, an example of which you can see in the last photo on this slide. When reviewing seclusion reports from the district, we found that the district referred to seclusion spaces in a range of ways. On this slide, you can see some examples of seclusion room terminology, including safe rooms, calming rooms, student support or success centers, talk it out rooms, sensory rooms, and other spaces mentioned before, like conference rooms, employee offices, and transition rooms. We want to note that this is not unique to this district. We regularly see in our investigations that districts use inconsistent terminology to describe their seclusion rooms and spaces, often causing confusion about where seclusions are actually taking place and how those spaces are to be used. In other districts, for example, we have heard schools refer to rooms in which seclusion occurs as refocus rooms, quiet rooms, blue rooms, and reset rooms. Sometimes these labels are used to falsely portray seclusions as a more therapeutic behavioral intervention or to present these rooms in a more favorable light to parents. Regardless of the various terminology used by schools in the district for these spaces, our investigation found that students were involuntarily directed to and confined in these spaces alone and were not able to leave on their own accord, making them seclusions and not spaces where students could voluntarily go to calm down or de-escalate. As you can see from the examples on this slide, even when students were secluded in these other areas and not a school's designated seclusion room, school employees would block the student's ability to leave the space and use conditions like timers before allowing a student to leave seclusion, even though the district's policy was that seclusion should end when a student is no longer an imminent risk of harm to oneself or others. Overall, our investigation found that the district engaged in improper seclusion practices that denied students with disabilities access to the district's programs and services. Even though students with IEPs constituted only 15% of the district's student population, we found that there were 30 times more seclusions, restraints, and transports per student with an IEP than per student without an IEP. We also found that instead of meeting the needs of students with disabilities that affect their behavior, the district subdued them through unnecessary restraints and improper confinement alone in small seclusion spaces, sometimes multiple times in one day, and often for excessive periods of time. As a result of these practices, some students lost hundreds of hours of instructional time. Our investigation also found that the district did not end seclusion where students showed signs of crisis or trauma, or when there was no longer any threat of harm. We also found that the district had failed to provide and implement the necessary strategies and supports to anticipate and manage disability-related behaviors, instead relying inappropriately on seclusions and restraints. For example, we found that the district inadequately conducted functional behavioral assessments and did not substantively review or implement student behavioral intervention plans in a meaningful way to avoid future incidents of seclusion or restraint. I'm now going to pass it over to Matthew to talk about the remedies our settlement agreement put in place to address our investigation's findings.
Thanks so much, Bridget. At the conclusion of the United States' investigation, let me see if I can get my slide working here. We were able to negotiate and enter into a settlement with the district. That settlement set forth several requirements for the district, many of which can be found in many of our seclusion and restraint-based resolutions. The first and most applicable requirement to our discussion today was that the district immediately cease the use of seclusion and seclusion rooms and dismantle and repurpose existing seclusion rooms for purposes other than student behavior or discipline. We've since found that many buildings were actually glad to get the reclaimed space for storage or even offices. Of course, one challenge was defining what seclusion entailed. As already discussed, seclusion had many names in the district, and so we crafted a definition that would leave no doubt as to whether seclusion by another name would be allowed. As you can see on the slide, the key defining features are whether the confinement was voluntary, the student is alone, and if they are free or believe they are free to leave. Appropriate use of calming or de-escalating spaces where the student voluntarily goes to another location was unaffected and continues to be a viable option for behavior management and student support. To avoid any confusion about whether staff are allowed to functionally act as doors by blocking a student into a space and not allowing them to leave, we also included a provision in the settlement agreement that clarified that an adult blocking a student's means of egress from a room or area, blocking a student's escape route, or holding the door shut is considered seclusion under district policy and our agreement. Of course, banning seclusion without anything else may address a discriminatory practice, but that alone is not enough to fix the underlying cause. As a result, many of the provisions of the settlement are focused on creating the infrastructure and practices to prevent the situations that led to the use of seclusion and restraint in the first place. So first, our settlement agreements do not allow for bad restraint practices to replace bad seclusion practices. And as you can see here, although restraints continue to be permitted, their use is limited and they are reserved for rare situations where a student poses a present high degree of risk to themselves or others. As part of this, we also require that district staff utilize appropriate de-escalation techniques, follow appropriate protocols in the student's BIP or behavior intervention plan, if applicable, and only turn to physical restraint as a last resort. Second, as Bridget mentioned earlier, during our investigation, we found that inadequate and improper functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, and behavior intervention plans compounded the issues that led to students with disabilities being disproportionately restrained and secluded. Therefore, as part of our settlement, we required the district to review all FBAs and BIPs and conduct new FBAs and revise existing BIPs to meet the requirements of the settlement agreement. These requirements primarily revolved around ensuring that both FBAs and BIPs were targeted, supported by data, and perhaps most importantly, clear in how staff would respond to target behaviors. The agreement also required that BIPs would be monitored for fidelity. Another component of our settlement revolved around ensuring that district staff have that training that Dr. Kraisman was talking about to support what they were being asked to do. This meant requiring regular trainings on FBAs and BIPs, de-escalation, classroom management, functions of behavior, crisis prevention and response, and more. Next, our agreement placed a lot of emphasis on what can be done to prevent future incidents if a student is restrained. And this had several components to it. First, after physical restraints, students are to be provided counseling and psychological services by a professional who is not involved in the restraint. One reason for this requirement is to allow the student, ideally, to reestablish a sense of safety and connection that would ultimately allow the student to return to focusing on their education more quickly. We also require that after each physical restraint, the crisis prevention team would meet promptly afterwards to review what happened and discuss what went well, what didn't work well, if policies and procedures were followed, and how to avoid the situation in the future. The debrief is not about calling people out for mistakes, but it's actually about processing crisis events and learning from them to improve for the future. The final major component of our settlement revolves around accountability. Our settlements are designed to provide districts with the tools necessary to see everything through, but also to get the information they need to adjust to meet the goals of the settlement. With this district, for example, we required the creation of 2 new positions, with the more senior of the 2 reporting directly to the superintendent. These 2 positions are responsible for coordinating related training, educating staff, monitoring restraints and crisis calls, debriefing with teams, monitoring data, and ensuring compliance overall with the terms of the settlement agreement. Next, we created detailed requirements around the type and categories of data that the district should gather and monitor, particularly around physical restraints. This data allows the district to identify trends, review staff actions, and be proactive in giving staff the supports they need to prevent crises from occurring in the first place. Finally, signing a settlement is the starting point for compliance monitoring. We continue to monitor districts through the compliance period to ensure that the goals of the settlement agreement are being met and to address concerns or changing situations as they arise. I will briefly note that since entering into the settlement agreement, and in addition to the complete elimination of the use of seclusion, this district has also seen a dramatic decline in the number of physical restraints used and an increase in the quality of interventions and supports provided to students. And we continue to work collaboratively with this district toward meeting the goals of the settlement. So for more information about EOS's work to combat improper seclusion of students with disabilities in public schools, please visit our website, which is displayed on this slide. And finally, if you believe your civil rights or those of someone else have been violated, including with the use of seclusion or restraint in schools, you can submit a report at civilrights.justice.gov. You should also feel free to reach out to Jim, Bridget, or myself. Our email addresses are here. If you have any complaints, concerns, or questions, and if we can't help, we'll do whatever we can to point you in the right direction. Thank you all, and I'll hand it back to Jim.
Thank you, Matthew. Fortunately, we have some time for questions, and we already have some questions in the chat. And if people have additional questions, we'll try and find time to answer them. But before we get to that, I wanted to just give Dr. Kreisman and others a chance to say more about what school districts should and can be doing as an alternative to seclusion or involuntary timeouts, because I think that's often the question we get is, what should be done both when behavioral crises emerge and also what can be done proactively to prevent the recurrence of that kind of behavior. I think Michael's trying to take himself off mute.
I could talk first. Yeah, and I think there's two pieces to this. I think the first piece is, the behaviors leading to like the timeout, right? And I think one of the things that you see when there's places which are relying heavily on the use of seclusion or timeout, or have really high numbers of restraints, is that the behavior of concern is followed by a lot of behaviors that occurred prior to that behavior. So things that are occurring in the classroom where students who are demonstrating through their behaviors their needs, and those needs aren't being met and they're being ignored. And what you tend to get is an escalation of lower level behaviors until that behavior reaches a level which somebody determines, this is an unsafe behavior and now we're in a crisis. And so, and this comes right back to sort of thinking a lot about what are the individuals working directly with those students, what is their knowledge, what is their training, and what are they doing? They should be very aware of understanding behavior. They should be good observers of behavior. They should be able to understand when a child is exhibiting a behavior, what's the function of that behavior? What is the student trying to get? How are they demonstrating their wants or needs? And there's, I'm just going to pick let's say students with autism, who may not have the ability to demonstrate that need verbally. So these behaviors become the mechanism by which they are demonstrating a need. And if the adults do not understand what that is, they typically will intervene with reactive measures which escalate that behavior because they aren't actually responding to the need of that behavior. So for instance, if a student was trying to escape a situation which was aversive, and the adults were doing things to keep the student in that place and working their interventions were essentially preventing the student from escaping, what the student will do is escalate those behaviors to try to get away from that situation. So I would say the first piece is really understanding behavior and really understanding and implementing evidence-based behavioral interventions that are designed to respond to the underlying cause or function of that behavior. That's critical. And I think this is where functional behavioral assessments are a critical tool. I think having behavior intervention plans are critical, but it's also critical that they're implemented with fidelity. I think Bridget mentioned that you find places that have FBAs and BIPs, but they're not written to the needs of the student, and they're not being implemented with fidelity when they are. And so those pieces are critical. The other is you really need trained crisis response teams who really understand the needs of the students that they're intervening with. And I think not only do they need to be trained in whatever crisis response program that the district is utilizing, but they need to understand the students themselves, the needs of those students, and to understand how to respond uniquely to the unique needs of a student, as opposed to taking sort of a general approach to students. So this would mean that a student with, autism who has some particular behavior of concern, that they know what that behavior is for that student, and their de-escalation measures are designed with that understanding. And that really changes, I think, dramatically the likelihood that a behavior escalates. And I think those are the two things I would say, by and large, prevent the likelihood of a problem behavior occurring.
Thanks, Michael. Liza, do you have anything you want to add on kind of the Massachusetts landscape or resources that people should know about?
Sure. Yeah. So in response to the question about what should be done instead of using timeout rooms, I would emphasize that from a legal standpoint, current Massachusetts law and regulations really do emphasize preventive strategies and de-escalation strategies to avoid reaching the point of needing to use physical restraint or timeout. And under Massachusetts regs, I just wanted to emphasize that physical restraint really is an emergency procedure of last resort. And so school districts should be doing everything possible to prevent, and this overlaps with a lot of what Michael was saying, to prevent the need to use any of these last resort procedures. And then, once a student is highly dysregulated, when that does happen, then schools are required, whenever possible, to use de-escalation strategies in that moment. And in terms of the preventive strategies that can be used, the first thing I would say is just that school districts should be really focusing on, if it's a student with a disability, adhering to special education law, going back to the IEP team process, convening the IEP team if a student is having behavioral challenges, conducting a functional behavioral assessment to, as Michael was alluding to, really get at what is the function of the behavior, why is this behavior occurring, and then implementing a behavioral intervention plan that is more supportive, that is more focused on positive reinforcement. And if the school is really carefully doing all of those things and then reconvening if the issues are continuing, to talk again about services, talk again about placement, to revisit the behavioral intervention plan. If the school is really diligent about following those steps, in many cases that will prevent the need to actually get to the place where the student is so escalated that these practices are even being considered. So that's what and then again, once that moment occurs where there is a threat of assault or imminent serious physical harm, a threat to imminent serious physical harm to self or others, then a physical restraint may be used, but for safety, but only if the student is not responsive to verbal directives or other behavioral interventions, or if de-escalation for some reason would not be appropriate in the circumstances. So the example that I like to use as a student is like running into traffic. Well, yes, like under Massachusetts regulations, in that instance, a staff person may kind of immediately physically restrain the child from running into traffic for safety purposes. But there's a whole lot that can and should be done in the context of a classroom to prevent getting to the point of where a child is so escalated that any of these interventions would even be considered.
Thanks, Liza. Just turning to some questions we got in the chat, and I think, Michael, you're probably the best one to answer this one. One question that's being asked is, how does this apply to students in residential settings? And I would also throw in like students in self-contained programs. Do these same principles work the same way for the highest need students, or should we think about it in a different way?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And I think, my likely thought about the question is, when you're in a residential treatment program, when you're not in school, what is the obligation for that entity? And I would say it's identical, right? The residential treatment program adopts the responsibility, right, throughout 24 hours a day. And so it'd be equally inappropriate that they would then have use of seclusion rooms in the residence portion of their day, right? So that they're, if they're in separate rooms, or if they're in a dorm unit, that they should not have any use of seclusion in those settings either, because the purpose of a residential treatment program is designed fundamentally to respond to the needs of these children throughout the day, because their prior placements were ineffective at supporting those students' needs. And I would just, articulate again for Jim's point, the more segregated the setting, what I think is those settings should be more highly skilled, more highly trained, and better equipped to support students with these needs, and should utilize and rely upon these, alternate like restraint or seclusion less than a typical setting, because the whole purpose of these settings is to provide, the types of services and supports needed for students with these intense needs. So I would say, yeah, 100%. It's the same, standard to be applied.
Thank you. And I would just add, from the DOJ perspective, we have done cases and settlements that involved, specialized schools, and including in places where there weren't private placements. And so the students we were seeing in these specialized schools were students who in other districts would have gone to a private placement. And we put the same alternatives in place to the use of seclusion and saw similarly positive results. So I think there's a lot of proof in the pudding in things that we have scene. I don't know if Matthew, do you want to add anything based on your experience?
I would just say that two quick points. One is that in like psychiatric residential treatment facilities for minors, there are a set of rules and regulations promulgated by the United States Department of Health and Human Services related to the use of restraint, and I also believe seclusion. The federal law that we've been talking about for purposes of our jurisdiction is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's something that applies everywhere. If an act by a local entity or a government entity is resulting in discrimination against individuals with disabilities, that constitutes potentially a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, whether something is or is not discrimination based on all the circumstances is the big question. But I do want to emphasize that the universal or near universal applicability of that statute.
Thanks, Matthew. Another question we have in the chat that, again, I think Dr. Kreisman is the best to answer is someone asked, when a restraint is necessary and there is not a quote unquote safe room in the school, where are the staff supposed to go? Isn't it safer to have a student in a room that's free of desks and chairs and that creates an environment free of other students who would otherwise want to watch the restraint?
Oh, so the lot to that one. I would just start by articulating that, you know, in a crisis situation, right, the districts all have opted for a particular crisis and prevention response system. So something like crisis prevention, intervention, therapeutic crisis intervention, safety care, whatever the standards are. And I would say those really guide the processes and procedures. And I think that it's very, very rare that what occurs is a behavior that is extremely unsafe, requiring a restraint that happens unexpectedly. And I think this is one of the problems that I think in places where you're seeing frequent problem behaviors that are deemed unsafe, is that there's a problem at the onset with failing to adequately support the students in the settings that they're in, right? Not providing the types of interventions and supports they need. So I just want to lay that out first, because I think there's often a sense that this behavior occurred and it was out of the blue. But if you really looked at, you know, and to Liza's point, there's something that led to that behavior, and it's most likely the adults failed to identify, observe, and predict what was going to happen as a result of that. So I would just start there. But for the other, I think, you know, there are a number of processes you can apply. If a student is being unsafe to others and you're in a classroom and you determine that there's no way to prevent this immediately, you could clear the classroom so that other students are not there. I would hazard to say it's an appropriate strategy to escort a student to another room as a part of that, because what you really need to follow is whatever the prescribed procedures are for a seclusion and for a restraint. And that may mean that based on the level and severity of that behavior, the thing that needs to happen at that moment is to prevent that through a physical restraint. And I think if that were happening, the wise move, if others were there, is you could clear that room, get everybody out safely so that nothing occurs there. But on the other hand, I just want to say, I don't think that the position is there can't be rooms that are free of, free of things. There can't be rooms that students can go to that are open spaces that are less, that have quiet and that they're quiet, there aren't other kids in there. The question is, are these locked rooms that are used specifically for the purpose of seclusion? And my thought to this question is much more around, if that's an appropriate place and the student can self-select to go there, prior to any behavior occurring, I would say that's fine. I would worry that become what I often see is these become the places, then it becomes an involuntary use. And I think that's the careful position to kind of, walk, that once something is there, that it cannot then be suddenly used as, well, this is the safe room, and so let's just take them to the safe room. And I think taking a kid to that room is likely not in accordance with whatever the safety procedures are for the crisis prevention protocols.
Eliza, did you want to say something about that?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to add that one approach that I think is really important and effective is for schools and classrooms to be affirmatively teaching students the skills to identify when they are feeling emotionally dysregulated, such that they themselves can identify that they need to take a break and maybe need to move to like a corner of the class that is calm and quiet, where they feel safe, so that they can regulate themselves and then return to the classroom activity. But if that space ends up being used as a punishment, then the student is not going to want to go there. So as soon as the school staff start mandating that a student go there, it becomes a space the student doesn't want to go to. But if the teachers are affirmatively teaching the skills to identify emotional dysregulation, and then identifying or using the skills to move oneself to a calmer space, I think that's really the ideal. And there may be a certain level of teacher staff support that's needed to help a student learn those skills from like a supportive and compassionate standpoint. But as soon as it sort of moves into the involuntary space, I think that's when there are more problems. And so, yeah, and the only other thing I wanted to add is I oftentimes get the question, isn't a timeout room like less restrictive than restraint? And I think, if you're talking about a timeout space, like a corner of a classroom, and a student walks voluntarily to that space, or maybe with some support or guidance, gentle support and guidance from a staff person, then yes, that's a less intrusive strategy. But if the student is highly dysregulated and refusing to move to another space, then, and I think Michael and others have alluded to this, then oftentimes it actually requires a physical restraint and physically moving them into the timeout room. And then you have a situation where you have both the physical restraint, which is more intrusive, and placing them in the timeout room. And in some circumstances, depending on the facts, if it is involuntary, and they're placed in the room by themselves, and they're prevented from leaving, and there's not a staff person there with them, then that could be unlawful seclusion under Massachusetts law.
And if I could just add one thing, because I agree 100%. The other thing that we've seen in these cases, and I think is pretty standard, is once seclusion gets used, and I showed that video, you actually start to increase the likelihood of the problem behavior recurring. Because once that student is in there, the student needs to be gotten out of there. And what we've seen in repeated records are, we open the door, the kid runs at us, we restrain them again, push them back into the seclusion room, and shut the door again. So what's happening is not a de-escalation or even a long-term reduction in the likelihood of those behaviors to recur. It's the reverse. You're actually leading to students developing more problematic behaviors or more severe problem behaviors. And I say, so yeah, I would say like it's not less restrictive, it's more restrictive, because not only have you had to implement a restraint, you've had to implement a restraint that is not in compliance with the safety protocols of whatever crisis prevention restraint procedures you're implementing, because there's none that suggests that you could push the kid away and then use your hands and shut the door on them. There's no such protocol that allows for that.
Thank you both. Another question we got that I definitely want to get to, because I think we get it a lot and it goes to the heart of the issue. Someone asked, many educators seem to think that taking away the ability to seclude students would make them and their other students less safe. Can you speak to this? And I actually want to start speaking that That has not been our experience in all these cases. As Matthew mentioned, we've actually seen less restraints happening when we've done away with seclusion. In a case I work on, when they ended seclusion, they also reduced restraints by 90%. And while restraints are available as a safety option, they tend not to get used. And what we instead see is that once teachers move away from a culture of using seclusion, it turns out they can manage behavior in other ways, especially if they get some help in managing that behavior, either by more help in dividing designing interventions and supports, or just a culture that's more supportive and kind of makes a bigger differentiation between things that are crises and behavior that may be, undesirable, but is not providing a safety problem. And I would say actually the biggest fans in our agreements in the districts we've worked on in the ending of the seclusion at the end of the day becomes the school staff, because no one goes into teaching because they want to restrain kids and throw them in a locked room. It's very traumatizing for the teachers and the other school staff to be repeatedly restraining students. And so often they tell us that they're so grateful that this change was made, and they just didn't realize there was another way to do that. So I think that's an important point, and I encourage Michael to jump in on this point because he's the real expert.
Well, I would just agree. That's 100% correct. I think in the case that with Matthew and Bridget, which involved a separate school for kids with serious emotional behavioral disorders, that was a concern that they expressed early. They were worried about what would happen, and on a subsequent visit, what they really found was they gave the teachers and educators the skills they needed to intervene and work with those students. And they didn't even think about needing seclusion anymore. In fact, they started to realize, I think, what we were stating, which was the seclusion is actually causing more problems. It's making things worse. Not only is it traumatic and harmful, but you're not improving the behaviors that you think you are. You're very likely reinforcing those behaviors. And I just think that the conversation we had with the director of that school was profound in the level at which I think they understood that this has changed the climate of that school, and it's improved the overall culture as well as the behaviors that take place. So they were dealing with fewer behavioral incidents as a result of not utilizing seclusion and restraint as a reactive response.
Matthew or Bridget, do you have anything you want to add on that point?
I would just agree and emphasize that EOS has reached a series of settlement agreements with districts all across the country on this topic. And even in districts where, we saw that people thought eliminating and limiting these practices like seclusion or restraint could not be done, what we often see once we get into compliance monitoring stage is that schools are realizing and appreciating that their practices have substantially improved, that they do not need to rely on the use of seclusion, and that the improved use of positive behavioral interventions and support has led to, like Michael said, fewer restraints of students generally, and staff better being able to meet the needs of their students, which creates a safer and more positive environment for everyone, students and employees alike. So I think we would just say, from our experience, it can be done, and it can be done in a way that is better for staff and students. It does take buy-in and commitment at all levels in a school district.
And I'm just going to put one last pitch on top of that is, it's hard, I think, for school district, it's hard for everybody to sort of take a step back and look at their own role in the behaviors of children. But 99% of the serious incidents that occur are associated with the ways adults respond to child behavior. And I think what we're talking about, all of these pieces we're talking about, is changing the ways adults respond is the key. And adults, it's hard to do, but you need to understand that you're part of a behavioral and, a series of behaviors between you and a child. The child behaviors don't occur in isolation or in a vacuum. And I think This is why when I started and talked about training, that is where this occurs. When you start to get, give the skills to the educators to respond appropriately, and they are able to do it, they are also reinforced because they are starting to see they don't have to deal with this issue over and over. As Jim pointed out, they aren't taking kids into seclusion and being exposed to kind of all of the traumatic aspects of that process anymore. And so it's just really important to understand that it's a change not only in kind of the culture and climate, but the behaviors of the adults in ways that are beneficial to not only the child, but also to their own working conditions.
Yeah, and if I could just briefly, I agree with that completely. And I wanted to just emphasize the critical importance of addressing the underlying culture and climate in a school and taking that work really seriously. And that work is not always easy, but it's really essential. And I have seen scenarios in which some of the practices we're talking about are used as a means of punishment. If a student is not following directives, for example, that physical restraint is then used. And I wanted to emphasize that under Massachusetts regulations, physical restraint is prohibited as a means of punishment or because a student is not following directives. And that what's really necessary is for schools to be engaging in the process of really evaluating their own culture and climate and figuring out how to shift the dynamic so it's not a culture of control, but more a culture of support and providing students what they need to prevent these kinds of behavioral incidents from occurring. And at the end of the day, I think this has been emphasized throughout the day, that relationships are so critical to this work, like having positive, meaningful relationships amongst students and between students and staff, between the children and the adults is so vital. And it sounds so basic, but really wanted to just come back and emphasize that point.
Thanks, Liza. And we have tons of good questions in the chat, but I know we're over time. So I just want to thank the panelists and also thank everyone involved in organizing this for inviting myself and my colleagues from the DOJ. So I'm going to turn it back to Tim or to Stephanie.
Thank you very much. We'd love to go through more of the questions, but we do need to respect our interpreters and card transcribers. So we will end the morning's presentation here and remind people that you need a different link to come into the breakout rooms this afternoon. That link is in the email assigning you to a particular breakout room. We'll see you at 1 o'clock. Stephanie, anything further?
Just that a reminder that the 1 to 4 is the breakout room, and then at 4 o'clock we're going to come back to this link for our closing panel with takeaways. Thank you to everyone for a really productive morning.
Thank you.